Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Let's begin with story 1, The Robe and the Scimitar, Bedouins of the Empty Quarter. You are standing at the edge of the Rub al-Khali, the Empty Quarter. It is one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The horizon stretches in undulating waves of sand, a moving ocean without water. The wind hums endlessly. It isn't a wind that refreshes. It's dry, sharp, and blinding, carrying with it tiny particles of sand that can strip skin from bone over time. Yet for thousands of years, people lived here, moved through here, fought wars here. And they did it wrapped in layers of cloth. You might wonder how. How could they survive under so many layers in such heat? Shouldn't less be more in the desert? That's the paradox of the desert. More is often less. And what seems illogical, like wearing a thick wool robe in 110 degrees F heat, is exactly what kept people alive. The first secret: airflow overprotection. The Bedouins of Arabia, among the most famous desert dwellers, developed an entire clothing system not for beauty or for battle, but for survival. A flowing robe, the thawb or dishdasha, loose and full length, combined with a headscarf, the keffiyeh or shemag, often secured with a rope band, formed the basic ensemble. To the untrained eye, these garments might look hot. They're not. The brilliance lies in how they interact with the environment. Loose robes create airflow between the skin and the fabric. As the hot desert wind passes over the robe, it pulls sweat from the skin and encourages evaporation, cooling the body through convection. Tight armor, by contrast, traps heat. Metal conducts the sun's rays directly into the body, turning a suit of mail into a slow cooker. So the robe doesn't just shield the wearer, it becomes an insulator against extremes. In the heat, it cools. In the cold desert night, it retains warmth. Armor does neither. It is binary, hot in the day, cold at night, and always heavy. Armor was a liability, not a shield. In the early medieval period, particularly during the Crusades, European knights often entered desert lands clad in full suits of chainmail or plate armor. This made sense in the green fields of France or the forests of Germany. It made no sense in the dunes of Arabia. The average chainmail hauberk weighed anywhere from 25 to 30 pounds. Add a helmet, greaves, gauntlets, and a shield, and the full kit could exceed 50 pounds. And while it protected against blades and arrows, it offered no protection from dehydration or heat stroke. Bedouin warriors, by contrast, wore minimal leather armor, if any. Instead of trying to resist blows, they avoided them entirely, striking swiftly from horseback or camel, then vanishing into the landscape. Their robes, soft and flowing, allowed full mobility and better endurance. Armor might turn a blade, but in the desert, it couldn't turn away the sun. The body under stress, sweat, salt, and the science of survival. Let's look at the physiology. In 110 degrees F heat, the human body produces up to 1.5 liters of sweat per hour during exertion. In armor, this sweat has nowhere to go. The skin is soaked, but evaporation, the body's primary cooling method, is blocked. Core temperature rises. Organs begin to fail. Fatigue sets in quickly. Desert robes, on the other hand, use capillary action and strategic wicking. Sweat is pulled away from the skin and exposed to moving air. More evaporation means more cooling. But even more clever is the salt line. Many Bedouins learned how to monitor hydration by examining the white salt streaks left in their robes. A useful warning: stop soon or die. Armor gives no such warnings. When a knight collapsed from heat exhaustion, he often collapsed into death. The value of shade in a shadeless world. In a world without trees, shade becomes clothing. The robe acts as a personal tent. A desert robe might extend several inches away from the body, providing a mobile canopy. The multiple layers trap a pocket of air, cooling it as it moves. This layering also protects from sunburn, sand abrasion, and even venomous bites. Snakes and scorpions, common in the desert, strike low. A loose robe flutters rather than hugging the leg, and many bites hit cloth, not skin. In this way, fabric served as armor, but not the kind forged by smiths. Camouflage and the fluid identity of fabric. In a terrain where movement draws the eye, blending in with the sand was a tactical advantage. Earth-toned robes made warriors invisible from a distance. Shimmering in heat, the human outline blurred, becoming just another dune. Armor glinted, metal flashed. Knights could be seen miles away, their polished surfaces betraying their location long before their arrival. In tribal warfare, ambiguity could mean survival. A robe might be a disguise, a tribal signal, or a decoy. Armor declared allegiance and station. Robes concealed them. An entire lifestyle built around a robe. Clothing didn't stop at survival, it extended to tools, bedding, even shelter. The same robe worn during travel could be unfurled as a tent or wrapped around supplies to protect them from heat. A keffiyeh might serve as a water filter, a sling, or even a bandage. Armor had one purpose: protection from violence. Desert clothing had many. Utility meant survival. A final image, the battle that wasn't fought. In 1259, during a minor campaign in southern Arabia, a Frankish knight chronicled the retreat of his unit through a narrow desert pass. The enemy never showed themselves. There was no battle. But 10 of his men died not from arrows or blades, but from exhaustion and exposure. Their enemies, he wrote, were as shadows in the sand. They walked like ghosts and left no tracks. He didn't know that the ghosts were men in robes, watching from dunes, waiting for the metal men to die under their own weight. Why then did armor persist in some cultures and vanish in others? And what did this choice say about the nature of warfare, mobility, and power in desert civilizations? If the benefits of loose robes were so clear, if the desert itself punished armor with the precision of a siege weapon, then why did so many outside powers continue to send men wrapped in metal into the sand? The answer lies in culture, habit, and the slow death of outdated ideas. To understand this, we have to examine why armor mattered so much in the first place, and why that meaning proved fatal in the desert. The symbol of steel. In medieval Europe, armor wasn't just protection, it was identity. A suit of chainmail or later plate armor was a mark of status. It was expensive, often custom-fitted, and typically reserved for knights and nobility. Armor wasn't mass-produced. A full suit could cost the equivalent of a peasant's lifetime earnings. To abandon it even temporarily was to shed not just protection but rank. A knight without armor was a naked man, no longer set apart by class, wealth, or reputation. In Europe, this wasn't just tactically foolish, it was socially dangerous. By contrast, desert cultures like the Bedouin operated within a nomadic honor system, where skill, reputation, and survival often trumped material display. Lightness, adaptability, and resourcefulness were signs of mastery, not heavy burdens of steel. The desert didn't care about class. You couldn't negotiate with the sun. No matter how blue your blood was, no matter how many squires carried your gear, the sand would burn, the wind would sting, and the heat would bake you from within. The desert equalized all men. And yet, Western military command structures were built on hierarchy. Knights rode while footmen walked. Officers made decisions from shaded tents while soldiers bore the sun. The idea of a knight dismounting, shedding armor, and dressing like a local guide felt backward, like regression. And so the chainmail remained, even when it killed. Failed adaptations, the light armor that was. Some crusader leaders did try to adapt. By the 12th century, reports began to circulate about lighter armor variants being issued to soldiers bound for the Levant. These included padded gambesons, thick cloth coats, and attempts at wearing partial mail over looser clothing. But the innovations were clumsy. The Europeans did not yet grasp the principle of desert wear. They tried to scale down their armor rather than rethink the design entirely. Whereas Bedouin robes worked with the environment, these lightened outfits were still layered wrong, often trapping heat. The gambeson, for example, was designed to absorb impact, not to encourage airflow, and once soaked in sweat, it became a sponge that steamed under the sun. The goal was still defense, not thermoregulation. They hadn't learned that the greatest threat in the desert wasn't a blade, it was the air itself. Mountains of logistics, tents full of errors. Supporting an armored army in desert terrain required enormous logistical efforts. European forces needed water in massive, constant supply, food for men and horses, none of which could be easily foraged in the sand, spare armor parts, tools for repairs, blacksmiths, beasts of burden to carry the weight. The Bedouins needed almost none of this. They traveled light. A single camel could carry both rider and supplies for weeks. They ate dates, dried meat, and flatbread. They drank camel milk and collected dew water using cloth traps at night. In many cases, Crusader supply lines collapsed under their own weight, and when they did, entire units perished without ever facing an enemy. The Battle of Hattin, 1187, when the sun fought for Saladin. Perhaps the most famous and tragic example of this mismatch came at the Battle of Hattin. The Crusader army led by Guy of Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, marched across a dry plateau under July sun, burdened by armor, thirst, and poor planning. Saladin's forces, meanwhile, controlled the wells. As the heat intensified, Crusader morale cracked. Soldiers began collapsing. Horses fell. Armor, once their pride, now seared skin and drained strength. Saladin's troops harassed them with arrows, but the real killing blow came from nature. By the time the main engagement began, many Franks were already half dead. The result, a crushing defeat. Most of the Crusader leadership was captured. Many were executed. The Holy Cross, their sacred relic, was lost. Saladin, notably, wore no armor. His men, in robes and turbans, flowed across the battlefield like wind. It was not just a military victory, it was a cultural demonstration. Western chroniclers noticed but dismissed it. Strikingly, many European chroniclers wrote about the desert clothing of their enemies, with a mix of disdain and curiosity. One Templar chronicler described the Muslim warriors as being like ghosts clothed in tents, appearing and vanishing. Others mocked the loose robes as unmanly, immodest, or effeminate, failing to see their genius. This reflects a deeper issue: cultural blindness. In the European martial tradition, clothing was meant to impress or intimidate. The concept of clothing as a survival tool, shaped entirely by environment, was alien, so they failed to learn, even after defeat. When some did learn, the merchant advantage. But not everyone ignored the lesson. Merchants, unlike knights, were practical. As trade expanded, especially with the growth of desert caravans and Silk Road branches, many European traders began to adopt local dress, often at the insistence of their guides. In 13th century Genoese shipping records, there are entries for desert linens, imported specifically for use on caravan journeys. Venetian traders traveling through North Africa often dressed as locals, not out of respect, but out of necessity. For them, the robe was not a political statement, it was a business tool. A change too slow. Despite growing evidence, the idea of fully shedding armor in desert conflict was not embraced by the West for centuries. Even in later campaigns, such as Napoleon's Egyptian expedition in the 18th century, European troops wore wool uniforms that stifled and killed. Armor may have faded, but the mental armor remained: the belief that technology and tradition would always prevail. They didn't understand that in the desert, adaptation beat invention, that robes were not primitive, they were precise instruments of survival. Desert as mirror, the environment as an opponent. Here lies a deeper truth. In Europe, war was often fought between men. In the desert, war was fought against the land itself. Armor helped you fight a man. It could not help you fight a sun that did not set, a sand that shifted beneath your feet, or a wind that whispered death in your ear. Desert clothing, soft, loose, and layered, was not about defeating the enemy. It was about outlasting the environment. The robe was less about warfare and more about existence. The Bedouin did not try to beat the desert, they became part of it. And in doing so, they defeated armored men without ever raising a blade. But how did these desert robes evolve? What were their roots, and how did centuries of innovation create garments perfectly tuned to survival? You've seen the Bedouin robe on the dunes flapping like a sail, ghostly in the heat. You've heard how it cooled the body, how it outlasted steel. But where did it come from? Was this brilliant adaptation just coincidence, or the result of centuries of quiet, deliberate refinement? To answer this, we must unweave the robe thread by thread back into the past. Before the robe, pre-Islamic Arabia and the birth of practical dress. Long before Islam, the Arabian Peninsula was a patchwork of oases, tribal territories, and nomadic routes. The land was punishing and resources were few. Clothing had to be made from what was available, and that meant wool, linen, or leather. Wool, surprisingly, became a foundation of desert attire. To someone unfamiliar with desert heat, wearing wool might seem like madness. But it turns out that lightweight woven wool, especially from goats or sheep adapted to arid climates, is both breathable and insulating. It can hold moisture without feeling soaked, and it resists the direct heat of the sun. Early versions of what we now call the thobe, a long, robe-like garment, began as simple rectangular tunics, often undyed. These early robes were often tied with rope or belts, folded at the waist, or layered. Designs weren't decorative, they were functional. What evolved over generations was not fashion, it was optimization. The rise of Islam and the spread of the robe. With the rise of Islam in the 7th century came rapid expansion across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. But with expansion also came integration. The Bedouins didn't remain isolated. Their clothing ideas merged with those of Persian, Egyptian, Berber, and Central Asian peoples. From each culture came new fabrics, dyes, and tailoring methods. From Persia, tailoring techniques that refined the shape of robes without losing airflow. From Egypt, access to flax and linen, which made robes lighter and quicker to dry. From the Berbers, the idea of indigo-dyed robes, which protected against insects and added prestige. From the Turks, influence of loose trousers, worn beneath the robe for modesty and mobility. Despite this cultural exchange, the basic principle stayed the same. Clothing should not fight the desert. The keffiyeh, a headscarf of 100 uses. While the robe is central, no desert ensemble is complete without the head covering the keffiyeh, gutra, or shemag, depending on region and variation. This seemingly simple cloth has at least a dozen uses. Sun protection for the face and neck. Wind barrier during sandstorms. Water filter in emergencies. Bandage or tourniquet for injuries. Signal flag for distant communication. Rope substitute for pack repairs. Even the way the keffiyeh is wrapped has meaning, signaling tribal affiliation, region, or rank. The design was not ornamental, it was a language and a lifeline. Camels, robes, and symbiosis. The camel deserves mention here. Not just a beast of burden, the camel-shaped clothing design. Camel riding required robes that didn't bunch between the legs and could be easily hitched or folded while riding. Camel hair was used to create blankets, cloaks, and even tent-like overrobes for winter travel. The motion of the camel dictated clothing that flowed with movement, not against it. Even the act of mounting or dismounting a camel demanded a specific kind of looseness, in clothing not too tight to restrict motion, not too long to trip over. Desert robes weren't made just for walking. They were tailored for mobility across vast, unforgiving land. Dye's status and survival, more than just fabric. As desert societies became more interconnected, robes took on layers of meaning. Indigo dye, used heavily by the Tuareg and Saharan tribes, was both practical deterring insects, filtering light, and symbolic status, wealth. White robes, common in Arabia, reflected sunlight and were favored for their cooling properties. They also symbolized purity and religious devotion. Black robes, often worn by the Abbasids, absorbed more heat but were sometimes layered over lighter fabrics to create complex insulation effects. But color had consequences. In hot climates, white offered visibility and cooling, while darker dyes offered concealment. A traveling merchant might wear beige or gray. A scout might wear dust-colored robes for camouflage. A tribal elder might wear elaborately embroidered cloth to distinguish his rank. What began as survival wear became a uniform, a signal, and eventually, a tradition. Adaptation through conflict. The desert robe versus the modern soldier. You might think the robe died out in the age of guns, trucks, and airplanes, but it didn't. In fact, even during the 20th century, campaigns, British colonial operations, WWI desert campaigns, French incursions in North Africa, the robe remained dominant among local populations. And in many cases, Western forces eventually adopted versions of it. British troops in T.E. Lawrence's Arab Revolt campaign wore flowing robes and keffiyehs to blend in and survive. French Foreign Legion soldiers adopted light cotton uniforms, modeled after traditional desert wear, abandoning tight wool uniforms used in Europe. Even in modern warfare, special forces in desert regions often wear loose, layered garments, more closely resembling Bedouin styles than modern combat uniforms. The robe never lost. It simply endured quietly, effectively. Clothing as resistance, identity, and continuity. In the 20th century, as borders were drawn and colonial powers imposed new rules, traditional dress took on a new significance. Robes became symbols of resistance against Western influence, pride in heritage, continuity across generations. Wearing a robe was no longer just practical, it was political. In many parts of the Middle East and North Africa today, the robe remains a fixture, and not just for elders. Even in modern cities, men don robes for prayer, for travel, or for formal gatherings. The keffiyeh, once just a sunshade, is now a global symbol of cultural identity. The final lesson of the robe. The robe's power lies not in its fabric, but in its philosophy. It teaches that nature cannot be conquered, only understood. Clothing is not armor, it is adaptation. What seems weak, soft fabric, open sandals, flowing lines can be stronger than steel when matched to the right environment. A knight in mail may seem invincible, but in the desert, he is a prisoner of his own traditions. A man in robes, with water in his skin and wind in his garments, is free. Closing reflection. The story of the robe is not dramatic. It contains no clashing swords, no grand duels. It's a story of heat, sand, sweat, and clever design, of people who, over centuries, listened to the land instead of trying to dominate it. In the age of satellites and synthetic fabrics, we often forget that survival once depended not on the newest invention, but on the oldest wisdom, on fabric chosen by function, not fashion, on breathability, not brilliance. And perhaps, if we listen closely, the wind still carries the lesson. Loosen your grip, flow with the air, live, not fight the land. Story 2, Crosswinds at Hattin, How Heat Defeated the Crusaders. Imagine this, you are wearing a heavy woolen tunic, Over it, a layer of padded linen. Then chainmail iron links, tens of thousands of them weighing nearly 30 pounds. You are in Palestine. It's July. The air is 100 degrees F in the shade, but there is no shade. Now imagine walking like this for 2 full days. This isn't fantasy. This was the real experience of many Crusader soldiers on the road to Hattin, one of the most consequential military defeats in medieval history, not just because of tactics, but because of heat, thirst, and a failure to respect the desert. This is not a story of knights and glory. It is a story of poor planning, environmental ignorance, and the slow suffocation of an army by its own assumptions. The context: the Holy Land in the 12th century. The year is 1187. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem has stood for nearly 90 years since the First Crusade, but cracks are showing. Internally, the Crusader states are divided. Factions vie for control: Templars, Hospitallers, native barons, and newly arrived Franks from Europe. Externally, a formidable opponent rises. Letter 1E63 A Macron, Letter 1E25 ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Saladin has managed to unite vast territories under a single banner: Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and parts of Arabia. His military campaigns are precise, patient, and calculating. But he also understands something his enemies often forget. You don't need to destroy your opponent with the sword if the sun will do it for you. The prelude: the Siege of Tiberias. In July 1187, Saladin lays siege to the fortress town of Tiberias, held by Count Raymond of Tripoli's wife, Esheva. It's a strategic lure. Saladin knows that the Crusaders will not let Tiberias fall without a fight, but he also knows they are far from water, camped at La Safari, a well-supplied and elevated position west of the Sea of Galilee. He is gambling that they'll abandon this advantage and march across arid land to engage him. He is right. Despite warnings from older commanders like Raymond, who had deep knowledge of the terrain, the Crusader High Council, dominated by King Guy of Lusignan and Gerard de Riedfort, the Grand Master of the Templars, decides to march. It is, in every sense, a fatal decision. The march begins, July 2nd, 1187. The Crusader army begins its march toward Tiberias. There are between 15,000 to 20,000 men, including about 300 mounted knights. They march in full gear. Water is scarce, the sun is oppressive, the dust is choking. The distance isn't enormous, about 20 kilometers, but the terrain is open, dry, and sun-baked. And Saladin has arranged for his forces to destroy or block access to every spring or well along the route. By midday, the army begins to falter. Heat as a weapon, the desert's silent arrow. Saladin doesn't engage directly. Instead, he sends mounted archers to harass the Crusader columns. They don't attack to kill, they attack to disrupt. This harassment forces the Crusaders to halt frequently, wasting precious daylight and making the march even slower. Each pause under the sun adds exhaustion, and still, there is no water. Some men begin to collapse. Horses refuse to move. By late afternoon, the Crusaders realize they cannot reach Tiberias by nightfall, so they decide to make camp near the extinct volcanoes known as the Horns of Hattin. There is still no water. The night of July 2nd, fire and dehydration. That night, Saladin's forces light brushfires downwind from the Crusader camp. The smoke blows through the parched encampment, compounding thirst and suffocation. No mercy, no sleep. The Crusaders are surrounded: no water, no mobility, no cover. Men drink from their own horses' blood, or from dirty pools formed by trampled ground. And Saladin waits. The morning of July 3rd, collapse. By dawn, the Crusader army is no longer a fighting force. It's a dehydrated, delirious mob. When Saladin finally orders the attack, the The Franks attempt to fight uphill toward a spring they think they can reach. But morale is broken. Horses collapse under heat and burden. Arrows rain down. Saladin's men are in robes, riding light horses, attacking with hit-and-run speed. They know this land, the Franks do not. By midday, the Crusader army is shattered. The aftermath, captured and executed. Most of the high-ranking Crusader lords are captured. Guy of Lusignan is spared. Reynold de Chatillon, notorious for brutal attacks on Muslim caravans, is executed personally by Saladin. All captured Templars and Hospitallers are executed, seen as too dangerous to be left alive. Most chillingly, the True Cross, the prized relic carried into battle by the Crusaders, is captured. Its seizure marks a spiritual and symbolic defeat. Not a battle of swords, but of decisions. The Battle of Hattin was not lost in combat. It was lost the moment the army left the spring at La Safari. It was lost when they chose honor over logic. They underestimated the heat. They wore iron instead of linen. They chose linear discipline over mobile tactics. In essence, they brought European warfare into an environment that obeyed none of its rules. Saladin's patience and environmental mastery. Saladin's brilliance wasn't just military, it was environmental. He saw the terrain not as a backdrop, but as a tool. He weaponized water scarcity, heat, distance, smoke, sleep deprivation. He forced the enemy to suffer the land before they ever saw his sword. A scene to imagine. A Crusader knight, barely able to stand, his chainmail hot to the touch, stares into the shimmering horizon. His throat is dry. The sun blinds him. He hears hoofbeats but cannot raise his sword. The last thing he sees is a white robe moving like a ghost between waves of heat. He never stood a chance, not because he was weak, but because he was wrong. But what lessons were actually learned from Hattin? Did anyone change their tactics, or did they double down on failed ideas? The defeat at Hattin was total, but you might assume that such a monumental failure, so clearly tied to poor decisions and a lack of environmental understanding, would prompt immediate changes in strategy, equipment, or mindset. It didn't. Not right away. Instead, for many Western powers, the loss was interpreted as a spiritual failure, not a logistical one. The enemy hadn't just outmaneuvered them, they had been permitted to win by God as punishment for the Crusaders' sins. And so, rather than adapt to the land, many tried to double down on faith and tradition, ignoring the very real forces that had led to their collapse. But not all remained blind. In the aftermath of Hattin, a slow and often reluctant learning process began. Some lessons were absorbed, some were distorted, and some were simply ignored. The immediate response, the fall of Jerusalem. The impact of the Battle of Hattin was swift. Barely 3 months later, in October 1187, Jerusalem fell to Saladin. The Holy City, long held by the Franks, was now in Muslim hands. This defeat shook Christendom to its core. Pope Gregory VIII issued a call for the Third Crusade almost immediately. Across Europe, kings and nobles took up the cross. Among them, Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart. Richard would become a central figure in Crusader myth, but also in the evolving understanding of how to fight in the Levant. The Third Crusade, 1189-1192, adaptation in slow motion. Richard was not a fool. While still committed to the glory of knighthood, Richard took notes from Hattin. His campaign included improvements in supply chains, naval resupply, intelligence gathering, camp hygiene, and water management. But what he didn't change, what almost no one changed, was the armor. The idea of discarding heavy mail in favor of looser, regionally appropriate garments remained an unthinkable concession. Why? because to do so would admit that the primitive locals knew better, and to a European knight that was unacceptable. Instead, they focused on mitigating exposure, shorter marches, better water planning, and delaying attacks until evening. It helped, but it didn't solve the core problem. Armor stays, suffering continues. Even with these changes, crusaders still collapsed from heat. Chroniclers frequently mention rotting feet from long marches, blistered skin from overheated armor, sunstroke, especially among new arrivals from Europe. The improvements were incremental. Survival improved, but the cost was still high. Richard, despite his brilliance in battle, never captured Jerusalem. Like others before him, he was forced to acknowledge that the land itself was unconquerable without adaptation. He did, however, negotiate a treaty allowing Christian pilgrims to access the city. It was a political solution to a military impasse and an admission of sorts. The Islamic view, a war of patience. From Saladin's side, the Crusaders were not just foreign invaders. They were a people at odds with the climate, the terrain, and even the animals. Arab chroniclers often describe the Crusaders as clumsy in heat, sweating like pigs, moving like statues of iron. They noted how the Franks struggled to sleep, to ride, to eat local food. Their lives required constant maintenance, blacksmiths to fix armor, cooks to prepare preserved foods, and elaborate supply chains. In contrast, the Muslim armies were self-sufficient, light and flexible. This wasn't just military, it was cultural. The desert was not the enemy. It was a known quantity, one that could be used to grind down enemies before a blade was ever drawn. Small lessons, quiet adaptations. Over time, some Crusader factions began to learn not officially, but out of necessity. Desert scouts were hired from local tribes. Some European lords adopted lighter surcoats and sandals when off-duty. Templars began issuing linen undergarment to help with sweat absorption. Horses were replaced with hardier breeds, better suited to the rocky terrain. But these adaptations were piecemeal. Structural change was too slow. Crusader fortresses still imported supplies from Europe. Armorers still shipped iron hauberks. Commanders still viewed mobility as less noble than endurance. The lesson of Hatton lingered, but it didn't transform military culture. A strategic shift from expansion to defense. One of the most significant post-Hatton changes wasn't in clothing, it was in strategy. After such a devastating defeat, Crusader states stopped expanding. They shifted to a defensive mindset focused on fortifying cities, strengthening castles, avoiding open battle. It was a concession. They could no longer project power deep into enemy territory. They had learned that the desert could not be marched across lightly. This meant less movement, more entrenchment, and fewer battles like Hatton. Lessons from the locals, the invisible instructors. Interestingly, one of the ways Crusaders slowly began to survive longer in the Levant was by learning, quietly, from non-combatants. Arab Christian guides who taught them about water holes and safe paths. Local traders who introduced them to cooling herbs and salt management. Desert farmers who showed them when to travel and when to stay still. But these lessons rarely made it into official manuals or doctrine. The elite still clung to their customs, and those who learned from locals were often viewed as suspicious or gone native. The desert robe was never formally adopted by Crusader forces, even when it was clear it worked better. The deep root of the problem, pride over adaptation. The real tragedy wasn't tactical, it was philosophical. The Crusaders viewed themselves as bearers of divine order, bringing civilization to a foreign land. To adopt the tools and garments of their enemies felt like surrender. It wasn't just impractical, it was, to them, immoral. So they remained encased in iron, sweating under a sun they could not escape, unable or unwilling to ask the simple question, what if they were right? Scene to imagine, a soldier's regret. Picture a young foot soldier on his third campaign. He's sitting by a cracked water skin, mail hood pushed back, watching dust blow across a scorched plain. He wraps his head in a stolen keffiyeh, just to keep from fainting. He doesn't know that men like him, in another world, are still being sent into the desert with iron and pride. He just knows the robe works. And he wonders, why don't they all wear it? But the story doesn't end with the Crusades. As time marched on and empires grew, new armies entered the desert. Napoleons, Britons, even modern ones. Did they learn from Hatton? Or did history repeat itself again and again in the heat? The memory of the Battle of Hatton might have faded from public discourse over the centuries, but its silent lesson that nature is an enemy as deadly as any army echoed into the age of empire and gunpowder. And yet history repeated itself. As Western empires moved into North Africa and the Middle East during the 18th and 19th centuries, they came armored not in chainmail, but in assumptions. They carried with them the same blindness that led the Crusaders across the desert in iron. The sun, the sand, the thirst, none of it had changed. Napoleon in Egypt, 1798, Empire meets the dunes. In the summer of 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte landed in Alexandria with over 35,000 men. It was to be the beginning of a grand expedition, a French empire in the East, a blow to British influence, and a scientific mission all in one. But very quickly, Egypt reminded Napoleon that he was not in Europe. French soldiers wore wool uniforms, carried heavy packs, and marched in formation through open desert terrain. Heat exhaustion struck quickly. Water sources were rare, and local knowledge was either ignored or distrusted. Napoleon himself was aware of the harsh climate. In letters, he commented on the need to move at night, the difficulty of supply, and the unsuitability of European clothing. But institutional inertia remained. Even after suffering the same symptoms as the Crusaders: dehydration, heat stroke, disorientation, the French troops persisted in wearing dark, fitted uniforms, boots not designed for sand, and headgear that trapped heat. They were not crushed militarily. They won many battles, but their capacity to govern and hold territory eroded fast. Much like at Hatton, the real enemy wasn't men, it was the land. The British in Sudan and Palestine, repeating the march. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the British Empire fought numerous campaigns in Sudan, Palestine, and Arabia. They arrived with red coats, pith helmets, leather belts, and the belief that discipline overcame climate. This belief often cost them dearly. During the Modest War, 1881–1899, in Sudan, British forces again faced the familiar problem: sunstroke, dehydration, and exhaustion long before contact with the enemy. They too failed to adopt local garments, even when operating side by side with Sudanese or Egyptian allies dressed in loose cotton robes and turbans. Even in World War I, the British Sinai and Palestine campaign saw soldiers marching in heavy gear across the same open terrain that broke the Crusaders centuries earlier. And again, the robe won. Why didn't the modern armies learn? You might ask, how could industrialized armies, with better science and greater reach, still make the same mistakes? The answer lies in military culture, not intelligence. Uniforms were not just clothing. They were symbols of empire, hierarchy, and discipline. Just like armor had been a marker of status in medieval times, the uniform was a statement of modern superiority. To dress like the locals, or worse, to learn from them, was seen as softness or cultural betrayal. There were exceptions, of course. Some officers in the British Arab Bureau, like T.E. Lawrence, wore local robes and moved like Bedouins. French Foreign Legion units in the Sahara eventually adopted light khaki, flowing garments, and even headscarves. But these were anomalies, individuals who adapted, not institutions. The garment that endured. Throughout all this, one garment remained unchanged, the desert robe. Its variations, dishdasha, burnous, jalaba, gandhara, all followed the same principles. Breathable fabric. Full body covering. Protection against wind, sand, and sun. Freedom of movement. These robes were not nostalgic or ceremonial. They were evidence of adaptation refined over millennia. In the 20th century, as synthetic fibers and desert camouflage entered the scene, Western armies began to design clothing inspired by traditional desert wear, including layered cotton uniforms, scarves for dust and sun, lightweight materials for temperature regulation. It had taken centuries, but finally, military science caught up to what the Bedouins had always known: the camel corps and colonial learning. Interestingly, by the late 19th century, some colonial units did begin to understand the value of desert-appropriate gear. The Sudan Camel Corps, operated by British colonial officers, began to equip soldiers with loose cotton robes and white turbans. French colonial officers in Algeria and Tunisia experimented with light robes and sandals for Saharan patrols. The use of camels instead of horses became more common, another adaptation long known to local tribes. These shifts weren't ideological, they were tactical necessities, and they worked. But such changes were rarely adopted back in Europe. As soon as campaigns ended, the knowledge vanished from doctrine, forgotten until the next desert war. Modern lessons: desert warfare in the 21st century. Even today, desert warfare draws on the same ancient knowledge. Modern armies now issue moisture-wicking base layers, combat shirts with air vents, multicam desert uniforms, tactical shemags, nearly identical to the ancient keffiyeh, and special forces operating in North Africa and the Middle East often wear robes over gear to blend in, reduce profile, and improve ventilation. The lesson of Hatton, finally, has been institutionalized not because of humility, but because the cost of ignoring it was too high. The robe as the winner of wars. It's strange to think of clothing as a victor in warfare, but over centuries, the loose desert robe has outlasted dynasties, outperformed armor, and outadapted empires. It wasn't invented by kings, commissioned by generals, or funded by governments. It was refined by shepherds, traders, scouts, and mothers, those who needed to survive, not to conquer. Its triumph lies not in glory, but in quiet, practical success. A closing image. Imagine standing on the same ridge where the Crusaders once camped before Hatton. The wind still moves the dust the same way. The sun still beats down with the same fire. No army stands there now, but somewhere, a shepherd in robes walks the ridge, guiding his goats to shade. He carries no sword, but he is winning the war that has lasted thousands of years, the war with the desert. Final reflection. The story of Hatton is not just a tale of military defeat. It's a parable of arrogance versus adaptation, of imported ideals crushed by environmental truth. It reminds us that you don't conquer a land by force, you survive it by learning. And in that survival, a robe, a simple, fluttering piece of cloth, has done more than armies ever could. Story 3: Nomads and Needles, the Tuareg's Indigo Secret. You are watching the horizon in the Sahara, where heat waves blur distance and time. A caravan approaches, not fast but deliberate. The camels step in rhythm. The air smells of dust and sun-dried leather. And then you see them, men dressed in deep indigo, faces veiled, robes flowing in the wind. They look like shadows painted blue. This is no accident. These are the Tuareg, often called the blue people of the Sahara. Not because they wear blue, but because they are stained by it. Their robes and veils, dyed with natural indigo, bleed into the skin with time. Fingers, necks, and cheeks all turn a faint blue-gray, as if history itself has soaked into their skin. It is one of the most enduring images of desert life, so striking, so foreign, and yet grounded in centuries of adaptation. This is not the story of warriors or conquests. It is the story of cloth, color, craft, and identity in one of the world's harshest landscapes. Who are the Tuareg? The Tuareg are a Berber-speaking nomadic people, spread across the central Sahara and Sahel from southern Algeria to Niger, Mali, Libya, and Burkina Faso. Unlike the more centralized Islamic caliphates of the medieval period, the Tuareg maintained a decentralized tribal system, guided by confederations of clans. Their society was matrilineal, and their survival depended on mobility, knowledge of water sources, and mastery of trade routes. But their most iconic feature, what set them apart visually, was their clothing, particularly the indigo veil or tajamust, worn by men. This cloth wasn't just practical. It became a symbol of identity, spirituality, and status, and it held within its weave the history of adaptation, trade, and resistance. The indigo robe, function meets symbolism. Why indigo? There are practical reasons. Indigo dye acts as a natural insect repellent, reflects certain wavelengths of sunlight, helping with heat, darkens with wear, developing a sheen that repels sand and dust, has antibacterial properties, helping with hygiene during long journeys. But it's more than that. In Tuareg society, indigo is a mark of prestige. The deeper and darker the blue, the more respected the wearer. The process of dyeing isn't just utilitarian, it's sacred, carried out by women, passed down through generations, and requiring extreme patience. Unlike synthetic dyes, natural indigo doesn't fully bind with fibers. The dye rubs off slowly, staining the skin of the wearer. Over time, this became a badge of honor. Veiled men, unveiled women. Perhaps the most striking inversion in Tuareg culture is that men veil their faces, and women do not. This stands in contrast to nearly every other Islamic society, where modesty rules often place the burden of veiling on women. The tajamust, a long strip of indigo-dyed cotton, often over 10 feet long, covers the lower face and nose, leaving only the eyes visible. Tuareg men begin wearing it in adolescence, and it becomes a lifelong companion. The reasons are complex. Spiritual belief. The veil is said to guard against evil spirits and protect honor. Practicality. It filters sand and dust, especially during desert travel. Cultural distinction. The veil marks adult status, dignity, and presence. Even in death, some Tuareg men are buried with their faces veiled. The art of dyeing, a slow mastery. The dyeing process is neither fast nor simple. Indigo comes from a plant, Indigofera tinctoria, or similar local species. The leaves are fermented, dried, and turned into a paste or powder. The cloth, usually fine cotton, is dipped repeatedly in vats of dye, then beaten with stones to create a glossy, metallic finish. This can take days or weeks, depending on the desired depth of color. It is labor-intensive, smelly, and messy work, yet it produces some of the most beautiful and resilient fabrics in the world. The gloss is not just visual. It helps repel sand and moisture, making it ideal for desert wear. This is technology rooted in tradition, not industrial, but no less sophisticated. Caravans and trade, wearing wealth. Tuareg society thrived on trans-Saharan trade, especially between the 10th and 16th centuries. They were not empire builders, but they were gatekeepers controlling key caravan routes across the Sahara. They transported gold from West Africa, salt from the mines of Taghaza, slaves, tragically, like many in the region, and textiles, including their own indigo-dyed cloth. To wear richly dyed robes was a statement. I trade with the world. It signaled not only status but connection to Timbuktu, Cairo, Fez, and beyond. And unlike metal armor or imported silks, the robe could be made locally, with local knowledge, by women of the community. Ritual rhythm and robes. The robe or bubu wasn't static. It changed with season, ceremony, and tribe. During marriage rituals, deep indigo was preferred. On long journeys, lighter robes might be worn underneath. At gatherings, the shimmer of polished cloth was a quiet competition. Even camels were draped in dyed cloths during festival, a show of prosperity. This created a rhythm of dye, wear, fade, and re-dye. The life of a robe could span decades, passed down from father to son, still bearing the fingerprints of the woman who dyed it. It wasn't just clothing, it was heritage. Contrast with armor, why fabric wins again. In the Sahara, no one wore armor. Not just because of the heat, but because armor slows, traps sweat, and limits flexibility. Even in conflict, Tuareg warriors preferred light leather shields, lances and swords suited for horseback, robes that allowed quick dismounts, agility, and minimal noise. They fought through speed, not attrition. And once again, it's clear, cloth was not weakness, it was strategy. A scene to imagine, silent blue on the dunes. It's night. The stars blaze in the black sky. A small caravan rests near a shallow wadi. The fire burns low. You see a man in an indigo robe adjusting his camel's saddle. His veil hides all but his eyes. As he moves, the firelight catches the robe's polished surface. It reflects briefly like armor, but it is soft, silent, and centuries older than any sword. The cloth isn't just for comfort, it's a uniform of survival. But what happened when the world modernized? Did the robe survive colonization, war, and modern textiles? Or did the indigo vanish into history? The world moved forward trains, guns, borders, but the Sahara changed little. The wind still carved dunes, the sun still punished the unprepared, and the Tuareg still wore blue. Yet the 19th and 20th centuries would test the strength of this ancient society and the fabric that cloaked it. European colonial empires swept across North Africa, drawing lines in sand where none had been before. Their flags waved briefly, but their ambitions left scars. And amidst it all, the indigo robe remained sometimes in defiance, sometimes in retreat, but always present. This is the story of how cloth became resistance, how tradition was both preserved and challenged, and how the blue of the Tuareg did not fade. The scramble for the Sahara. In the late 1800s, European powers sought to divide Africa among themselves. France, in particular, aimed to control a north-south corridor from Algeria to the Gulf of Guinea, cutting directly through Tuareg territory. To the colonial mind, the Tuareg were a problem. They were unmapped. They were nomadic and hard to control. They had no capital, no bureaucracy, and no uniforms, just robes, camels, and complex alliances. But what colonizers failed to see was that these robes were a form of soft power. They allowed Tuareg society to blend, adapt, vanish, and return. The very things that made the Tuareg appear backward, in the eyes of colonial administrators, made them nearly impossible to subdue. Cloth and resistance. Colonial efforts to civilize the Tuareg involved disarmament, taxation, and the forced establishment of settlements. These policies clashed with the very foundation of Tuareg culture. In response, many Tuareg groups retreated deeper into the Sahara, withdrew from trade routes, focusing instead on internal networks, preserved dress traditions even more fiercely as a marker of independence. The indigo veil, once just a cultural symbol, now became political. Wearing it was an act of quiet defiance. French officials noted with frustration that Tuareg men refused to adopt Western dress. even when offered new clothing or uniforms for cooperation. To remove the Tajamust was to remove one's identity. They chose to stay blue. The colonial lens, misunderstanding the veil. European anthropologists and officials often misunderstood the significance of Tuareg clothing. Reports describe veils hiding cowardice, primitive habits, unhygienic dye practices. They miss the deeper meanings, the spiritual, protective, and status-based dimensions of the robe and veil. This misunderstanding led to failed assimilation policies. Schools that demanded boys unveil saw high dropout rates. Settlements that required uniformity failed to attract families. The more the state pushed, the tighter the veils wrapped. Modern trade disruptions, the fall of indigo. By the 20th century, industrialization reached even the edges of the Sahara. Synthetic indigo became cheaper and easier to obtain. Mass-produced cloth flooded markets. Traditional dyeing became harder to sustain. Chemicals replaced plants. Foreign dyes replaced heritage. Some feared this meant the end of true Tuareg blue. But that didn't happen. Instead, a hybrid system emerged. Imported cloth was sometimes used, but still dyed traditionally. Old robes were recycled, repaired, redyed. Indigo production moved from domestic to semi-industrial cooperatives, often run by Tuareg women. Adaptation, not erasure. Even when using imported threads, the process, the ritual remained Tuareg. The role of women, keepers of color. Throughout these changes, Tuareg women remained the guardians of dying knowledge. Unlike many other patriarchal societies in the region, Tuareg women owned property, passed down lineage, and held control over textile production. A young man's robe might be dyed by his mother, his aunt, or his future bride. The depth of its color spoke of the care taken and the family it came from. During periods of repression or poverty, women kept the culture alive at the basin, at the loom, and by the fire. Indigo was not just color, it was matriarchal memory. The world takes notice. In the mid to late 20th century, as Africa's post-colonial era unfolded, global interest in indigenous cultures grew. Anthropologists, tourists, and filmmakers began to visit Tuareg regions. Images of blue-veiled men crossing golden dunes became iconic. For many, this was their first exposure to a non-European culture where men veiled and women did not, where beauty and utility lived in a robe. The Tuareg aesthetic, previously dismissed by colonizers, became celebrated in art galleries and travel journals. But this popularity was double-edged. As demand for authentic Tuareg textiles grew, so did commercialization. Some robes were now made for tourists, not for tribes. Dyeing was sometimes rushed or outsourced or stylized to appeal to global buyers. Still, in the homes and tents where culture mattered, the old methods endured. Scene to imagine, the dye pit in a modern village. A concrete tub half shaded. A group of women gather under the morning sun. One stirs the indigo vat, checking consistency. Another pounds cloth with a flat stone. Nearby, a boy watches his new robe being dyed. He may wear sneakers. He may have a mobile phone. But that robe, its cut, its color, its process is the same his grandfather wore when caravans crossed the Sahara by starlight. The past is not behind him. It's soaking into his skin. Why the robe survived when so much else didn't. Empires fell, borders shifted, languages evolved, but the Tuareg robe endured. Because it was never about fashion. It was never about conquest. It was about adaptation. The robe works. It keeps you alive in 120 degrees F heat. It repels insects, shields against sandstorms, stores scent and memory, conceals emotion and broadcasts status. It does more than armor ever could and asks for far less. That is why it remained. But what about today? In a world of global brands and climate change, can a robe still carry the weight of a people? Or has it become just another costume for sale? The desert still spreads beyond the cities. Camels still move along the horizon, though now they share space with motorcycles and pickup trucks. The indigo robes are still there flowing in the wind, wrapping faces in shimmering blue. But they now exist in two worlds. One is the ancestral world, where tradition guides the dye, the cut, and the wear of each cloth. The other is the modern world, where robes are seen through the lens of identity politics, fashion trends, tourism, and even geopolitics. The Tuareg have not vanished, and neither has their robe, but its meaning continues to evolve, quietly and profoundly. Globalization and the robe, identity in a digital world. Today, Tuareg youth live between nomadic heritage and global influence. Many still speak Tamashek, the Tuareg dialect of Berber. They still observe ritual veiling, particularly during ceremonies or travel. But they also watch videos on smartphones, study in urban schools, and wear jeans beneath their indigo tunics. For some, the robe has become a symbol of cultural pride, a statement piece in a world eager to homogenize. In towns like Agadez, Niger, or Timbuktu, Mali, you'll find young men wearing tailored robes with smartphone pockets sewn discreetly into the folds. They wear the veil in the city, not to block dust, but to assert who they are, even when surrounded by glass storefronts and power lines. It is no longer just survival wear, it is a stitched identity. Climate change and the return to old wisdom. Across the Sahel and Sahara, temperatures are rising, droughts are more severe, sandstorms are more frequent, wells go dry more often. In this context, traditional clothing is not a relic, it is a resource. Light-colored synthetic shirts trap heat. Western cotton trousers collect dust and offer little airflow. But the Tuareg robe, time-tested and terrain-matched, still works. Layered protection without suffocating heat. Face shielding that filters sand and sun. Air circulation designed by nature, not factories. NGOs working in desert communities now recommend traditional attire for certain regions, especially among herders and nomads. What once was targeted for replacement is now seen as resilient design. In some ways, the desert is reminding people what worked all along. Indigo today, from heritage to fashion industry. The indigo-dyed robe, once exclusively local, is now a global curiosity. High-end designers in Paris and Milan have drawn inspiration from Tuareg silhouettes. Textile cooperatives in Niger and Mali now sell hand-dyed fabric to global buyers. The Tuareg look has appeared in fashion shoots, museum exhibitions, and music videos. This comes with benefits: economic opportunities, international recognition, but also risks of cultural dilution. Some Tuareg artisans now make robes for export with synthetic indigo or chemical shortcuts, designed for tourists rather than desert travel. Others have resisted, insisting on traditional processes, even if slower and costlier. Here, the robe becomes something more than clothing again. It becomes a battleground between authenticity and efficiency, between craft and commerce. But even when sold, even when stylized, the robe carries its origin. It carries the memory of the woman who dyed it, the heat it was designed to resist, and the history woven into every hem. Women leading the way, guardians of cloth. In the 21st century, Tuareg women have become cultural anchors. They run workshops that teach traditional dyeing. They manage cooperative businesses, exporting robes and scarves. They lead community efforts to preserve cultural expression through clothing, storytelling, and education. As more men seek work in cities or mining camps, women have emerged not just as artisans, but as custodians of Tuareg identity. Some even say, to forget how to dye is to forget who we are. And so mothers teach daughters the way of the cloth, Even when synthetic dyes are cheaper and faster, the vat still bubbles, the cloth still glows blue, the robe still lives. Modern conflicts, ancient fabrics. In recent decades, Tuareg regions have experienced political unrest, rebellions, displacement, and terrorism have scarred parts of Mali, Niger, and Libya. And through it all, the robe has remained on fighters, on refugees, on negotiators, on elders. In refugee camps, men still veil. Women still wear indigo shawls. Aid workers note that even when food is short, people prioritize maintaining their clothing customs, patching and cleaning their robes with great care. For the Tuareg, the robe is not luxury. It is dignity. It is selfhood, even in displacement. A closing image, man and cloth side by side. You are in a small market in northern Niger. Two men sit under a straw awning. One wears a shirt and trousers, the other a brilliant indigo robe, face half covered. They drink tea. The robed man leans forward and says, "This robe is not old. It is new every time I wear it. New because I am still here." The robe doesn't just mark him as Tuareg. It marks him as a survivor, a steward, a bearer of knowledge older than any map. And tomorrow, when the sun rises and the wind kicks dust into the air, he will wrap his veil, adjust the folds, and step forward. Not because it is tradition, but because it works. Final reflection. We often look to the past for spectacle, wars, inventions, rulers, but the deeper story lies in what endured. The Tuareg indigo robe is a thread through time, unbroken, unarmored, and unbeaten. It is made not of gold, but of survival. It bears no crest, but it holds memory, environmental intelligence, and matrilineal heritage. In a world that changes too fast, it is a reminder. Sometimes the best way forward is to wear what already fits the world around you. Story 4. Armor rusts, cotton breathes. The Abbasid couriers. The Abbasid Caliphate stretched wide from the mountains of Persia to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the sands of Arabia to the lush fields of Mesopotamia. At its height in the 8th and 9th centuries, it was one of the most advanced civilizations in the world. And yet, for all its splendor, its golden domes, and learned scholars, the Abbasid Empire depended on something very simple to function. A man in a robe, running across the desert with a message. This is not an exaggeration. Before wireless signals, before the printing press, before telegraphs or railways, communication was human and embodied. And in the Abbasid world, it was robed, sand-covered, and often anonymous. This is the story of the Abbasid courier system, a logistical marvel of the medieval world, and how desert clothing made its existence possible. A vast empire, a need for speed. The Abbasids came to power in 750 CE, overthrowing the Umayyads and relocating the seat of power from Damascus to a newly built city, Baghdad. Unlike their predecessors, the Abbasids emphasized central administration, intellectual integration, and bureaucratic control. This required constant communication across thousands of miles. But the terrain was difficult. Deserts that burned by day and froze by night. Mountains that cut off cities for weeks. Seasonal rivers that vanished in summer and flooded in spring. And yet, tax records had to be delivered, military movements coordinated, edicts and instructions passed down from Baghdad to the frontiers. Enter the Barid, the courier system. The Barid, a quiet engine of empire. The Barid wasn't glamorous. It wasn't composed of soldiers or scholars. It was made up of runners, camel riders, messengers who knew every track, shortcut, and well. They traveled light, no weapons, no armor, just long cotton robes, sandals, head coverings, and satchels of documents. Their strength wasn't in might but in speed, knowledge, and stamina. Much like the Roman cursus publicus before them, the Barid relied on relay stations, spaced a day's ride apart. But where Roman couriers were often armored riders, Abbasid messengers were desert-adapted, designed for survival, not confrontation. Cotton over iron, the uniform of movement. So why not armor? Why not arm these messengers in chainmail like elite guards? The answer is simple. Armor slows, overheats, and dehydrates. Courier work required. Speed over long distances. Endurance in dry, shifting terrain. Clothing that could cool, layer, and adapt. The robe offered all this. Cotton absorbed sweat and allowed evaporation. Layers protected from sun, sand, and insects. Loose fits allowed ventilation without dragging on limbs. Even the head wrap served multiple purposes. Filtered breathing during sandstorms. Kept the scalp cool. Served as towel, sling, or water filter when needed. Armor was for war. This was movement through the empire's bloodstream. The courier's tools, simple and essential. What did an Abbasid courier carry? Scrolls or wax tablets with instructions or records. A seal to prove authenticity. Water skins, often made from goat hide. Dates, dried meat, or flatbread for sustenance. Possibly a small dagger, though most traveled unarmed. But the most important tool, memory. Couriers were trained to memorize routes, rhythms, and recovery spots. Many were selected from nomadic or semi-nomadic populations already familiar with desert navigation. Their clothing helped them pass unremarked, often blending in with traders, pilgrims, or shepherds. In a world without uniforms or tracking, anonymity was protection. Desert conditions as the real enemy. The biggest threats couriers faced were not bandits or political rivals, they were sandstorms, which could bury a track in minutes. Heat stroke from overexertion without enough shade. Dehydration, especially in lesser-traveled routes with unreliable wells. Cold during winter night crossings in high desert. And so, clothing became survival gear. A messenger who dressed poorly might never reach his station, not because of enemy swords, but because the sun never stopped burning. The robe, cotton soft and layered, was his shield. Baghdad's eyes and ears. The caliphs depended on the Barid, not just for orders but for intelligence. Couriers didn't just deliver messages, they observed how governors behaved, whether roads were maintained, rumors of dissent. Their reports helped Baghdad keep control of distant provinces like Khorasan, Yemen, and Ifriqiya. Often, a single note carried by one man could result in the recall of a provincial governor, a military mobilization, or even an inquisition into tax fraud. The empire spoke and listened through men in robes, bearing folded parchment and ink-smudged fingers. A scene to imagine, footsteps in the night. A courier walks under the moonlight. His sandals whisper against the dry stone. His robe flutters, catching the desert breeze. The message he carries could change a city's future or prevent a rebellion. He stops at a shaded rock, drinks from a goatskin, then moves on. He is not armed. He is not armored. But in that moment, he is the most important person in the empire. But what made these couriers reliable? How were they trained, managed, and trusted across such distances? And what happened when they failed or didn't return at all? In the quiet, swaying movements of a desert courier, there is something almost sacred, an invisible thread connecting the farthest reaches of an empire to its heart. But for the Abbasids, these messengers weren't simply wanderers, they were part of a complex state-run infrastructure. You might picture a lone man running over dunes, parchment in hand. But behind him stood a system of oversight, built on trust, fear, and, surprisingly, fabric. The Barid as a bureaucracy. By the early 9th century, under caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun, the Barid became not just a courier service, but a full governmental intelligence arm. The postmaster, letter 1E63 A Macron, letter 1E25 IB al-Barid, in each region reported directly to the caliph or vizier. These officials oversaw the maintenance of relay stations every till 20-30 km, the selection and training of messengers, record-keeping of deliveries and delays, security protocol for sensitive messages. Couriers were both messengers and informants. They observed quietly, often reporting on the conduct of governors, the morale of troops, local uprisings or dissent. They were the eyes and ears of Baghdad, dressed not in armor but in quiet robes, faces windswept, scrolls tied in oiled leather tubes. Training the messenger. What made a good Abbasid courier? Endurance. They had to travel dozens of kilometers a day, often on foot or camelback in extreme heat. Discretion. Some carried politically sensitive messages. Loose lips were dangerous. Multilingual skill. In an empire of Persians, Arabs, Turks, Berbers, and more, many couriers needed basic comprehension of local languages. Geographic memory. GPS did not exist. They had to remember water points, shaded valleys, danger zones, and tribal territories. Clothing discipline. Robes had to be functional, unencumbering, and well-maintained. A soaked hem could mean hours of extra heat retention. A loose head wrap could expose skin to the sun or sand. In many training centers, often attached to relay posts, new couriers learned these arts. They practiced fast-strapping headscarves, balancing loads, and layering tunics for temperature changes. Every fold of cloth had a function. Clothing as code. In a time without uniforms, couriers often signaled identity through robe style, fabric quality, or color stitching. A gray outer robe might indicate a message of routine administration. A dark indigo layer, over white, signaled urgency or military correspondence. A sash of a certain knot might indicate a secret dispatch. These clothing cues helped identify them at checkpoints, inns, and within government stations, avoiding delays and confirming legitimacy. Armor, by contrast, was too visible, too threatening. It slowed movement and invited attention. A courier needed to be light, quick, and nearly invisible when things went wrong. But not every message made it. Sandstorms buried riders, wells went dry, local conflicts erupted without warning. In many cases, messengers simply vanished, swallowed by the land. If a courier failed to report in, the postmasters began an inquiry. Another messenger would backtrack their route. Tribes near the route would be questioned. In some cases, the message itself was duplicated, with a second copy dispatched via an alternate route. For critical letters, the Abbasids often sent two messengers simultaneously, taking divergent paths, a primitive form of redundancy. But failure came with serious consequences. If it was found that a courier had opened a sealed scroll, sold a message, or colluded with rebels, they were often executed. Despite this, the Barids' record was remarkable. Most letters arrived, most roads watched, most robes dependable. The importance of silence. Abbasid couriers were not allowed to discuss their missions. Even among other messengers, they spoke in vague terms. This silence was strategic. It prevented leaks. It discouraged bribery. It emphasized that loyalty was shown through footsteps, not words. In a sense, the robe helped here too. It covered, softened, anonymized. One desert courier looked much like another. To the casual observer, he was no more than a man on his way home. Robes in the cold. While most of the Abbasid Empire baked under the sun, parts, particularly Persian highlands, northern Iraq, and eastern Anatolia, could be bitterly cold in winter. Here the courier robe adapted. Layering changed. Woolen undergarments were worn beneath cotton robes. Goat hair cloaks added outer insulation. The headscarf was tightened into a turban to preserve body heat. And still no armor. Armor might offer protection, but it also conducted cold, restricted movement in snow, made river crossings dangerous. The robe, meanwhile, could be dried easily, rewrapped mid-journey, or used as bedding if stranded. Baghdad's trust in cloth. Perhaps the most surprising thing is this. A caliph ruling over millions, commanding libraries and armies, trusted the empire's fate to men wearing cotton robes. Not knights, not ministers, not warriors. Just messengers equipped with knowledge, endurance, and cloth that did not fail. Even during rebellions, even in times of war, the caliphs prioritized the courier routes, repairing relay stations before forts, restoring water points before palaces. Because they understood, without the robe and its wearer, the empire stopped speaking. Seen to imagine the winter message. Snow falls in the Zagros foothills. A man wrapped in a triple-layered robe steps into a windswept pass. He knows this path. He knows the next fire is 8 hours away. Inside his satchel is a letter, inked and sealed in Baghdad. It holds orders for a general in the East, orders that may decide the fate of an entire campaign. The man does not draw a weapon. He adjusts his wrap, tightens his sandals, steps forward. Not a soldier, but the string between two stars in the Abbasid constellation. But what became of the courier system in later centuries? As dynasties rose and fell, did the robe still carry power? And how did clothing continue to determine who was trusted to move across the empire? Empires never end all at once, they dim. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the jewel of the Islamic world, began to fracture in the 10th century. Power slipped from Baghdad's hands not to invaders first, but to distance. Provinces grew more independent, governors more autonomous. The bonds holding the realm together loosened. And so too did the Barid, the courier system that once carried the empire's heartbeat. But what's remarkable is this. Even as caliphs lost armies, even as palaces crumbled and viziers schemed, the messengers kept walking. Their robes dusted with sand, their letters folded in satchels. They became the final lifeline of an empire that no longer spoke with one voice. This is the story of the slow unraveling of a logistical wonder, and how, even in collapse, desert clothing outlasted iron ambition. The Barid under strain. By the 10th century, the Abbasid world was a network of rival dynasties, each claiming allegiance or not to Baghdad. The Buyids controlled Persia. The Fatimids rose in Egypt. The Umayyads returned in Al-Andalus. The outer provinces began keeping their own records, minting their own coins, and critically building their own courier systems. The centralized imperial Barid began to erode. But local versions persisted, often modeled after the Abbasid structure, using the same relay system of posts, spaced by days' travel. Hearing couriers from local tribes with terrain familiarity, dressing them still in practical robes and veils, not armor or uniforms. Even when the empire splintered, the robe remained standard. It wasn't Baghdad's anymore. It was the desert's solution. What replaced the system? By the 11th century, the role of couriers began to shift from imperial agents to private messengers for merchants, diplomatic envoys between regional powers, scholarly letter-bearers, carrying philosophical and medical texts between distant centers of learning. The Barid was no longer a state monopoly, but its methods, especially the use of lightweight desert clothing, regional station networks, and informal intelligence collection, continued in adapted forms. Some routes remained active for centuries, long after their originating states fell. The robe outlived the map, the Mongol storm, and the end of Baghdad. The final blow came not from within, but from the east. In 1258, the Mongols under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad. The city burned. Thousands died. The libraries, canals, and courts were destroyed. And yet even in this moment, the robe had one final role to play. Tuareg-like desert scouts and messengers informed nearby regions of the Mongol advance. Tribes in the Arabian Peninsula adjusted their movements. Cities like Damascus and Cairo prepared defenses in part because of news carried by anonymous robed men, moving faster than formal armies. The Abbasid Empire had died, but its methods of communication, its couriers, its roads, its understanding of movement through terrain lived on. Legacy in the Mamluk and Ottoman eras. After the fall of Baghdad, new empires rose. The Mamluks in Egypt, the Ottomans in Anatolia and the Levant, smaller dynastic powers across Mesopotamia and the Gulf. Each inherited the logistical problems of ruling large desert and mountain territories. And so, without formal declaration, they borrowed the Abbasid model. Ottoman postal systems in the Arabian Peninsula used relay couriers in loose cotton clothing, often sourced from Bedouin tribes. Mamluk envoys wore robes indistinguishable from those of caravan merchants. This was no accident. Robes offered cover, comfort, and function in ways armor, wool, or European dress simply couldn't. Robes into modernity. By the 19th century, formal courier systems became outdated with the arrival of the telegraph, the railway, European postal codes, and bureaucracy. But in the deserts, the robes remained. Tribal couriers in Iraq, Syria, and Arabia still used well-placed relay camps, water caches marked with signs, and of course the robe, which remained unchanged in its cut, its logic, and its layered utility. In some areas, even as late as the 1950s, a document might still be carried across the Syrian desert by a man in sandals, a head wrap, and a robe, bearing the design first perfected 1,000 years earlier. No armor, no gun, just cotton sweat and the knowledge of wind. The robe as infrastructure. What few recognize is that the robe wasn't just clothing, it was part of the system. It reduced the need for excess food or water by helping regulate body heat. It allowed couriers to sleep without tents. It enabled blending in, avoiding unnecessary risk. In a very real sense, the robe was infrastructure like the road itself. Where armor made demands on the state blacksmiths, repairs, resources, the robe allowed a courier to move through nothingness with nothing but himself. Scene to imagine, the last imperial messenger. Somewhere around 1260, a messenger leaves Aleppo. The Mongols are approaching from the east. He wears a pale robe, patched and sun-faded. His scroll is hidden in a wax tube, slung under one arm. He passes abandoned watchposts. He drinks from a cracked goatskin. The road is silent. He is not armed. He is not fast. But he carries the last voice of an empire that no longer exists. And still he walks. Closing reflection, cloth that carried power. You might think empires are built by armies, governed by scribes, or remembered by architecture. But the Abbasids, arguably the most intellectually and administratively sophisticated empire of the medieval world, survived for centuries not just through laws or swords, but through robes. Soft, simple, functional. Armor may win battles, but in the long march of history, it is the robe that carries the message forward. Story 5: Caravans in the Sand, Trade, Robes, and Survival. Imagine a road with no pavement, no signs, and no visible edges. A road that shifts each day under the wind. A road where a wrong turn doesn't mean delay, it means death. And yet, for more than 1,000 years, this road connected cities and civilizations, not just across countries but across continents. This was the Trans-Saharan Caravan route, a network of paths, stopping points, and survival knowledge that made it possible to trade salt for gold, cloth for ivory, and stories for silence. At the center of it all stood not the merchant prince, nor the armed guard, but the robe. Because on this ancient highway of heat and shifting sands, the robe was not just what you wore. It was your shelter, your passport, your survival manual. This is the story of how people crossed deserts not with swords, but with sandals and cloth, and how trade moved, not in haste, but in rhythm with the wind. The Trans-Saharan trade, a slow miracle. For many centuries, especially between the 8th and 16th centuries, the Sahara wasn't a barrier. It was a bridge. Merchants moved between Gao, Timbuktu, and Kano in West Africa, Fez, Marrakesh, and Tripoli in North Africa, and across to Egypt, Arabia, and even India, via Red Sea or Mediterranean ports. What they carried: gold mined in Bambuk and Wangara, salt hewn from Taghaza and Bilma, slaves tragically part of the trade, textiles, especially dyed cloth and robes, books, religious texts and manuscripts, spices, copper, ivory, and ostrich feathers. But no road signs pointed the way. No governments paved the path. This was a mental map, passed orally from guide to guide. And at its heart was the camel, and the man in robes who knew how to walk beside it. Why the robe mattered more than armor. Crossing the Sahara was not a battle. It was endurance warfare against the elements. Daytime temperatures routinely exceeded 45 degrees C, 113 degrees F. Winds could create whiteout sandstorms in moments. Night could drop to near freezing. Skin exposed to sun would blister within hours. Armor had no place here. Instead, merchants, guides, guards, and even animals relied on robes made of breathable, natural fibers, cotton or wool, head coverings that shaded and filtered dust, layered garments, not to trap heat but to control its slowing evaporation, managing sweat, long sleeves and hemlines to protect from insects, sun, and the abrasive sting of sand. These weren't fashion choices. They were calibrated systems of protection. Desert logic: more layers, less heat. The untrained observer might assume less clothing means cooler body. But in the desert, this is dangerously false. The thick but loose robe does three vital things: insulates from direct solar radiation, encourages convection, warm air moves within the space between body and cloth, cooling the skin, slows dehydration by reducing exposed skin and managing perspiration. Armor, even leather, traps heat, sticks to skin, and creates heat zones where sweat cannot evaporate. A merchant in armor would not last more than a day. A man in robes could walk for weeks. The caravan, moving shade. Most caravans traveled early in the morning and late afternoon, avoiding the deadly midday sun. During stops, travelers used their robes to drape over sleeping mats, form makeshift tents between camels, wrap goods for protection, serve as pillows, shrouds, slings, and bandages. The robe was multifunctional equipment. Its value was equal to its weight in gold because without it, you couldn't carry the gold at all. Clothing as identity and permission. On these long routes, robes did more than protect the body. They also signaled origin, tribe, trade status, and religious alignment. A robe dyed in deep blue suggested tie to Tuareg regions. White robes indicated Islamic piety or pilgrimage. Embroidered hems might show affiliation with a trading house or noble family. Specific headwrap styles communicated ethnic group, region, or even status within a caravan. In many oasis cities, access to lodging, markets, or water depended on being properly dressed. A robe opened doors as surely as a passport today. Armor closed them. To wear foreign armor in a Saharan town was to declare you didn't belong, you didn't trust, you didn't understand the land. It was rarely done. Women in the caravan world. Though often overlooked, women participated in trans-Saharan trade, especially in West African cities like Timbuktu, Kano, and Jen. They wove and dyed cloth, managed logistics of trade stops, hosted merchants in domestic compounds, played roles as interpreters and negotiators. Women's robes flowing, often brightly dyed and adorned with jewelry, reflected not only regional style, but economic role. Robes here were not simply worn. They were carried as trade goods, used in dowries and marked status. Clothing was commerce. Surviving the journey, robes as medical tools. The desert offers little forgiveness. Medical supplies were few, so clothing took on emergency roles. Torn robe strips became tourniquets or bindings for splints. Headwraps soaked in water became cooling compresses. Cloth bags carried herbs, incense, or dried roots used in desert medicine. When someone died, and it happened often, they were shrouded in their robe, buried in the sand with a prayer. No armor ever did this. But the robe, even in death, served. Scene to imagine, the long dune crossing. The caravan moves slowly like a floating city. 30 camels, 50 people moving in rhythm. The sand is hot, but the air is dry. A boy adjusts the folds of his father's robe, copying the technique without words. Around him, robes flap like sails, silent, soft, and strong. One merchant turns to another, and with the gesture of adjusting a headwrap, says everything. We are alive, we are prepared, we can cross. But what happened when the caravans faded? When steamships replaced camels and highways replaced sand tracks? Did the robes disappear, or did they find new roles in modern trade and memory? The caravans ruled for 1,000 years. Step by step, robe by robe, they stitched continents together through silence and sand. But no network, no matter how old or vast, can survive untouched. The 19th and 20th centuries brought iron, steam, and boundaries. Railroads, customs checkpoints, European colonial borders sliced through the desert like knives through cloth. And slowly the camels stopped walking. But the robes remained. This is the story of how the world changed around the caravan, and how desert clothing adapted, resisted, and even found new forms in a world of freight trains, formal borders, and foreign flags. Colonial intrusion and the breaking of the route. By the mid-1800s, French, British, Italian, and Spanish forces had seized control of much of North and West Africa. Their goals weren't aligned with trans-Saharan trade. They sought extraction of resources, religious conversion, territorial dominance, suppression of nomadic independence. Caravans, with their fluid routes and tribal logistics, stood in the way. European authorities imposed tariffs and permits, established military posts along caravan paths, introduced railways, and redirected commerce toward coastal cities. The result was gradual but clear. Caravans grew shorter, less frequent, and less profitable. Cities like Timbuktu, once hubs of scholarship and gold, saw their centrality fade. But within this decline, something unexpected happened. The robe becomes resistance. As colonial officers attempted to enforce dress codes, particularly in schools, courts, and military service, desert peoples pushed back, refusing European uniforms, wearing traditional robes as protest, preserving dyeing and weaving practices in secret. The robe, once purely functional, now became a political and cultural statement. In regions like the Sahel, especially among Tuareg, Songhai, and Fulani populations, the robe came to mean, I am not colonized. I belong to the land. Your laws are not older than my cloth. Even when European cotton replaced local weaving, the cut, fold, and wrap remained traditional. A French officer might build a railway, but he could not make the desert man button his shirt. Trade within the ruins. Though cross-Sahara caravans dwindled, localized trade flourished. Merchants adapted, using trucks for part of the journey, camels for the rest. Trading robes and cloth at border markets, especially near Agadez, Zinder, and Kittel, turning oases into regional fairs, where desert peoples bartered goods, knowledge, and news. In these markets, the robe became currency as well as clothing. One high-quality, indigo-dyed robe could be exchanged for 30 days of millet, a goat, several sacks of salt. It was a store of value, durable, visible, wearable. Adaptations of the cloth. Even as roads paved over sand, robes adapted. New forms emerged. Synthetic dyes replaced natural indigo, offering brighter colors and quicker production. Hybrid designs merged traditional robes with stitched pockets, zippers, and tailored shoulders. Tourist markets grew, with robes made to be bought, not worn. And yet in remote regions, function remained key. Traders still wore double layers for temperature control. Drivers wrapped their heads with shemegs before long trips. Camp guards slept in their robes, curled under the stars with a dagger tucked inside. In short, the robe stopped being just a tool of survival and became a bridge between worlds. Women at the crossroads. Women, particularly in West Africa's Sahel zone, continued to drive cloth trade from behind the scenes, operating dye pits using both natural and chemical processes, organizing weaving cooperatives, managing cross-border cloth exchange. Their role expanded in post-colonial economies, where clothing became both cultural currency and source of independence. Robes weren't just survival tools, they became wedding attire, market uniforms, political dress worn during protests or regional festivals. One robe might be worn every day for labor, and then rewrapped in a specific style for a council meeting, a funeral, or a religious rite. The same cloth, reconfigured, changed meaning. No armor can do this. No helmet adapts to mood or message. But a robe can speak in folds. The road doesn't die, it transforms. While major trans-Saharan caravans faded, the idea of the route persisted. Young traders began using motorbikes and pickup trucks to retrace old paths. Mobile markets moved from oasis to oasis, following old calendars. Some modern entrepreneurs reinvigorated caravan trade for tourism, offering camel expeditions across traditional routes. In these efforts, robes returned to prominence not for fashion, but because they still worked best. Even tourists, warned not to wear tight synthetic hiking gear, were advised. Wear what the desert wears. Light cotton, long sleeves, head wraps. And as those tourists stepped into the dunes, sweating, squinting, stumbling, they saw something remarkable. The guide, wrapped in a robe, walking lightly, carrying nothing but a staff, was never out of breath. Scene to imagine: a border market at dawn. You are in northern Niger. A temporary market forms in the sand. Traders arrive by truck, motorbike, camel. Robes in every shade billow in the morning wind. A woman adjusts bolts of dyed cloth under her awning. A Tuareg man sharpens a knife. A boy drinks from a goatskin flask. This is not medieval, this is now. The road has changed, but the robe has not. It flows with time. But can the robe survive the full weight of the 21st century globalization, climate change, synthetic fabrics, and shifting cultural identity? Or will it become merely a costume, severed from its roots? The caravans have slowed. The camels no longer thunder across the horizon. Roads have names now, borders have guards, and commerce is tracked by satellites, not stars. But the robe remains. Worn in the morning market, at the mosque, in the desert camp, and the capital city, it flows around the ankles of people who still move to the rhythm of survival. The question is no longer whether the robe works. It's whether, in a world that forgets quickly, we will remember what it meant. Because the robe is not a relic. It's a record, a wearable history of adaptation, knowledge, and quiet strength. The modern robe, a thread through time. In the 21st century, robes continue to be formal dress in regions like Mali, Mauritania, Niger, and Chad. Everyday wear in rural markets and desert communities. Symbolic attire in ceremonies, elections, and religious observances. But more than that, robes now represent continuity and identity amidst political and cultural change. Resistance to homogenization in a globalized world. Pride in ancestry in places where colonial narratives once tried to erase memory. When a young man in Timbuktu dons his bubu, or a Tuareg woman wraps her head in indigo cloth, it's not nostalgia. It's cultural fluency speaking the language of ancestors in a modern dialect. Tourism, fashion, and the fine line. As global interest in West African aesthetics grows, robes have entered. Fashion runways in Paris and Milan. World music concerts, especially among Saharan blues musicians. Cultural exhibitions, where textiles are framed under glass. This visibility brings benefits, economic opportunities, preservation efforts, but also risks. The robe may be commodified, stripped of meaning, sold as a boho accessory, misappropriated, worn as costume without context, watered down, mass-produced without traditional methods or care. Yet in many regions, the core traditions survive. Families still pass down robes from parent to child. Indigo dye pits still bubble under desert suns. Sand still flutters against the same stitched hems that once walked from Kano to Cairo. The cloth may change, but the gesture of wrapping remains sacred. Climate change, a return to old wisdom. As the Sahara expands and the Sahel dries, modern infrastructure struggles. Temperatures soar past 50 degrees C. Crops fail. Cities overheat. But desert clothing endures. Robes, especially those of light cotton or woven wool, outperform synthetic alternatives in breathability, layered protection, reusability, low environmental impact. Organizations working on climate adaptation in West Africa now study traditional garments as models for sustainable design. The robe is not just enduring, it's future-proof. Migration and the portable homeland. In the 21st century, migration shapes identity. Men and women from Mali, Niger, Sudan, and Chad move north to Europe, North Africa, and urban centers. Some arrive with nothing but what they wear. Often, that includes a robe. Folded tightly for travel. Unfolded for prayer, warmth, or shade. Worn as a link to home, when surrounded by unfamiliar sounds and laws. In refugee camps, shelters, or transit towns, the robe becomes a blanket, a curtain, a statement. It says, I know who I am even if you don't. Robes and rituals, memory in motion. In weddings, the robe glows with embroidery. In funerals, it hangs heavy with silence. In council meetings, it lends gravity to the voice. In storytelling circles, it wraps the body while old legends unfurl. And in the quiet moments of evening, after tea, after work, after prayer, it is loosened, smoothed, and folded, ready for the next day. This daily act, repeated across generations, is cultural preservation through habit. No museum required. No textbook needed. Just cloth and the care with which it is worn. Scene to imagine the new road. A young trader stands at a truck stop on the Niger-Algeria border. He wears sneakers, has a smartphone in his pocket, but around his body, a robe billows in the desert wind. He leans against a tire, watching the dust swirl, waiting for the next ride north. He is not part of a caravan, but he walks a familiar road. One worn by salt traders, by gold carriers, by poets and preachers. And on his shoulders their cloth. Still strong, still flowing, still alive. Final reflection, the robe remembers. In the shifting sands of history, many things vanish. Empires crumble, armies are forgotten, borders are redrawn. But the robe survives not because it is powerful, but because it is right. It was designed not to conquer the land, but to understand it. Not to impose identity, but to express it. Not to dazzle, but to endure. And so, as we race into the future, the robe remains behind us, beside us, ahead of us. Whispering through its folds, I have crossed deserts, I have outlasted steel, I carry what you've forgotten. Story 6, Saharan Shade, How Desert Robes Outsmarted the Sun. There is a particular kind of silence in the Sahara. It's not absence but a pressure. The sun presses down, not just with heat, but with light so intense it seems to thicken the air itself. The sand reflects it upward. The wind, when it comes, brings no relief, just a dry rasp that stings the eyes and lips. And yet in this most extreme of climates people live. They move, they pray, they trade. And they wear layers. Thick robes, long sleeves, head coverings wrapped multiple times. In a land where the sun rules, these robes are not errors in logic. They are refined science experiments conducted not in laboratories, but over centuries of survival. This is the story of how desert dwellers defeated the sun, not with mirrors or machines, but with flowing cloth and instinctive physics. Heat is just about temperature. To understand desert clothing, you first have to understand desert heat. In the Sahara, air temperatures regularly reach 45–50 degrees C, 113–122 degrees F. Surface temperatures on sand can exceed 70 degrees C, 158 degrees F. UV radiation is intense, particularly at midday. Humidity is often below 10%, making sweat evaporate almost instantly. But here, the key. Direct solar radiation causes more heat stress than ambient air temperature, meaning what the sun does to your skin and clothing is more dangerous than the air you're breathing. And so, desert robes work not just by cooling the body, but by shielding it from solar attack. The robe as shade. Think of a desert robe like a Tuareg bubu or a Mauritanian dara as portable shade. It functions like a tent, a sun umbrella, a thermal barrier. Rather than exposing the skin to the sun, it creates a pocket of air between the body and the fabric. This space allows air circulation, moving heat away. Sweat evaporation, the body's primary cooling mechanism. Temperature buffering, protecting the skin from radiant heat. From a physics perspective, the robe acts as a convective chimney. Hot air rises within the space between cloth and body, drawing in cooler air from below. Armor traps heat, a robe guides it away. Why so many layers? The counterintuitive truth. In desert logic, more layers often means cooler body temperature. Desert dwellers typically wear a base layer, thin cotton to absorb sweat. A mid-layer, looser robe, often of heavier cotton or wool. A head covering, multi-layered to shield skull and neck. Why this works? Multiple layers slow heat transfer from outside to inside. They reduce UV penetration, which can damage skin even through fabric. The inner layer stays cooler because the outer layer absorbs and reflects much of the solar radiation. One study conducted in North Africa found that a robed individual had a lower core body temperature after 4 hours in the sun than someone in shorts and a t-shirt. More cloth, better outcome. Fabric choices, cotton versus wool versus synthetic. Traditional desert robes are made from light cotton for daily use. Wool blends for nomads who travel by night or in high desert cold. Linen in some Saharan and Sahelian communities. Each offers benefits. Cotton, highly breathable, absorbent, easy to wash. Wool, excellent temperature regulation, resists odor, insulates even when damp. Linen, wicks moisture rapidly, durable. What you won't find in traditional robes, polyester, nylon, or any synthetic moisture-wicking athletic fabrics. These modern materials don't breathe, trap sweat, and become heat traps in direct sun. In the Sahara, natural fibers are survival tools. The head, the most vital covered zone. Desert sun doesn't just burn the back of the neck, it bakes the brain. That's why head coverings like the Tajamus Tuareg, Chech Sahel, Kaffieh Arabian Peninsula are not optional, they're critical. They shield the scalp and neck from direct radiation, filter dust and wind from nostrils and mouth, create an evaporative cooling zone around the face, double as towels, masks, ropes, and wraps. Often these wraps are dark-colored indigo, black-brown, which seems odd but is, because the outer layer absorbs heat, creating a temperature gradient that draws cool air up from the lower layers. Again, it's convective cooling, not color alone, that matters. The robe as insulator at night. What many forget, deserts get cold fast. Temperatures can drop by 20-30 degrees C after sunset. Sand loses heat rapidly. Sweat chills the body. Here, the same robe that protected you from the sun becomes a blanket. Folded and wrapped, it conserves body heat. Used as bedding, it insulates against the ground. Pulled over the head, it creates a thermal cocoon. No need to change clothes, just rewrap the same cloth. Armor, by contrast, cools rapidly, offering no protection, turning dangerous in hours. The robe stays useful always. The social science of the robe. In many Saharan and Sahelian communities, the robe isn't just practical, it's social armor. Wearing multiple layers demonstrates knowledge of survival. A well-wrapped head signals readiness and maturity. Improper dressing suggests naivety, inexperience, or carelessness. To be underdressed in the desert isn't casual. It's an insult to the environment and to those who know it well. This expectation also fosters community mentorship. Elders teach young boys how to fold and tie wraps. Women prepare robes for husbands and sons before long journeys. Cloth becomes a shared language of protection. Even without words, a man adjusting his head wrap says, "I'm ready. I know what I'm doing. I belong here." Scene to imagine, midday rest under white cloth. The sun is at its peak. A caravan halts. One trader dismounts, unpacks a bundle of robes, and stretches it between two camels. Beneath it, a dome of soft light forms a tent of robes. Inside, men sit cross-legged, sipping from goatskin flasks, eating salted dates. A boy lies flat, his father's robe draped over him, cool despite the heat outside. This isn't just fabric. It's infrastructure, custom, shade, and science all sewn together. But how do these desert clothing systems hold up against modern forces, mass-produced textiles, climate shifts, and fashion industries? Can robes still serve when the desert itself begins to change? The sun hasn't changed. It still rises without hesitation, floods the dunes in white heat, and blinds the eye by midday. But the world beneath that sun has changed profoundly. Desert people now carry smartphones, not scrolls. Trucks move alongside camels. Military convoys pass through towns where caravans once reigned. And yet, through all of it, the robe remains. Not just because it's a habit, but because, even in the modern world, it continues to work better than almost anything else. In a time of synthetic fabrics, rapid change, and climate disruption, the desert robe has not become obsolete. It has become a tested technology with a proven record. This is the story of how ancient desert clothing systems continue to solve 21st century problems, and why, despite globalization, you still find the same cut of cloth protecting people from the same sun. The return of heat, climate change as a multiplier. Today, the Sahara and Sahel are heating faster than many other regions. Heat waves now last longer and reach higher temperatures. Water sources are more fragile and distant. Storms and winds are growing stronger and more frequent. For many, these are signs of a changing world, but for desert people, they are reminders. You must listen to the land. You must wear what the land accepts. And what the land has always accepted is the robe. The failure of modern fabrics. Western aid agencies and development organizations often arrive with good intentions and bad textiles. They bring t-shirts made of polyester that trap heat and sweat, jeans that absorb heat, restrict movement, and chafe in dry conditions, shoes designed for pavement, not sand. In contrast, traditional desert garments allow for maximum air movement, protect the entire body from UV and abrasion, require no synthetic blend, no factory, no power grid. In communities where grid access is limited and where every drop of sweat must count, natural fiber robes outperform industrial alternatives both in comfort and in survival. It is not backward to wear a robe in the desert. It is backward to assume that new materials are better just because they're new. Reinvention, the tech-friendly robe. Desert people innovate quietly. In many towns along the Sahelian belt, robes now feature hidden phone pockets stitched inside the folds, zippers for security, blending into traditional design, elastic cuffs, reducing dust intrusion during bike or vehicle travel, detachable head wraps, adapted for changing conditions. Tailors still cut and sew by hand, but they take orders for custom upgrades. These hybrid garments preserve the logic of airflow, the coverage of traditional robes, and the flexibility of modern life. The robe didn't resist modernization. It absorbed it and stayed useful. Urban settings, tradition in motion. In cities like Nouakchott, Niamey, and N'Djamena, robes remain daily wear. Government officials enter ministries in full-length traditional garments. Imams preach in layered cotton. Merchants sell electronics and grain wearing the same cuts their ancestors wore on the open dunes. The robe is not just rural. It has become civic attire, religious formality, business wear, fashion, but still, its utility and heat remain central. Taxi drivers wrap their headscarves between fares. Couriers adjust their robes before mounting scooters. Guards at gates position their veils to block sun glare. Even under concrete and glass, the robe's design airflow, light reflection, full body coverage still works best. The robe and identity, pride without performance. In the West, summer clothing often emphasizes performance metrics. Wick sweat, cools body temperature, anti-odor. But desert clothing makes no such claims. It simply works quietly for those who know how to wear it. The pride of wearing a robe comes not from style or labels, but from knowledge. How to wrap it to block dust from the nose. How to loosen it at midday and tighten it by dusk. How to wrap a child in it during a journey. How to shade a sleeping elder with its folds. The robe does not shout, it adapts. Solar engineering, centuries before science. When European scientists began studying passive cooling, they stumbled on ideas the desert already knew. Using airflow for heat transfer, layering to stabilize temperature fluctuations, reflective outer surfaces to repel sunlight. These are the exact principles behind desert robes. In architecture, this is known as bioclimatic design. In the desert, it is known as daily life. Your robe keeps you alive. Your robe teaches you about shade, time, and movement. And when the sun rises too fast, it tells you when to stop. Scene to imagine, the airfield and the elder. A military helicopter lands at a Saharan outpost. The wind kicks up dust. The pilot, sweating in a black jumpsuit, watches as an elder approaches. The man wears a layered robe. His face is half covered. He walks with ease across the blistering tarmac. He does not shield his eyes. He does not sweat. He nods once, offers a goatskin flask, and stands cool in the open sun. The younger man, surrounded by machines, realizes something. This old cloth is more advanced than anything I brought with me. But what of the next generation? Will they wear robes or reject them? Can tradition survive where fashion, economy, and modern schooling suggest otherwise? Or will the robe evolve yet again into something we haven't seen before? You've seen the robe as a tool, as shelter, as identity. But now we ask, can it survive the modern world? Can a garment that evolved in silence endure the noise of 21st century progress, urbanization, digital life, migration, and shifting fashion? Is there still a place for centuries of cloth logic, when even the desert itself is changing beneath our feet? The answer lies not in museums or memory, but in motion. Because the robe was never meant to be frozen in time. It was made to move, to adjust, to flow with the land, and that is what it continues to do. The robe in the age of air conditioning. Modernization brings asphalt, glass towers, and above all, cooling technology. In many Saharan and Sahelian cities, the ideal of progress is increasingly measured in access to air conditioning, imported clothing, Western-style office wear. Yet AC is expensive, power grids are fragile, and most work still happens outside in markets, farms, on foot. And so, while office buildings cool a few, the majority vendors, porters, drivers, street cleaners still wear robes. Not from nostalgia, but because the robe works where machines fail. It cools without electricity. It protects without plastic. It folds when needed, stretches when worn, and carries history in every seam. The robe is not a rival to technology. It is a backup plan for when technology fails, which it often does, in places of heat and hardship. Generational shifts. Will the youth keep rapping? You might imagine that modern youth have turned away from robes, and in some cases, yes. Many young men wear jeans, jerseys, and baseball caps in the cities. Music video feature Western outfits more than traditional dress. School uniforms replace robes with trousers and collared shirts. But that's only part of the picture. Across West and North Africa, a resurgence of cultural pride has emerged, particularly among artists, environmentalists, musicians, religious scholars. Wearing the robe has become a symbol of regional identity, connection to ancestors, rejection of colonial models of dress and beauty. It's not uncommon to see a teenager listening to rap music, texting on a smartphone, and wrapped in a robe tailored by his grandfather. Tradition and technology woven together. Robes on the move, migration and memory. As people migrate from the Sahara to Europe, robes go with them. They line the bottoms of suitcases, serve as blankets in transit camps, are worn again during Eid, Friday prayers, or weddings abroad. In exile or diaspora, the robe becomes a home within fabric. When wrapped around the shoulders, it carries the sound of sand underfoot, the scent of dried acacia wood, the feel of wind across a camel's back. Even in the cold corners of Berlin or Paris, there are mornings when a man steps outside, robe billowing in the breeze, not as costume, but as continuity, fashion, and the risk of forgetting. Of course, global fashion has discovered the robe. Designers reimagine it. Shortened, made from silk or synthetics, stripped of meaning. It appears on catwalks, in catalogs, in marketing campaigns that call it exotic or boho. And while this brings visibility, it also brings risk. A robe without function is not a robe, it's a shape, a silhouette. What gives the desert robe its soul is not its fabric, but its context. The sun overhead, the sand beneath, the body that moves within it. The knowledge passed from hand to hand, mouth to ear. Without that, it is hollow. But as long as there are people who remember why it works, the robe will never be empty. Environmental future, old answers for new problems. As climate change intensifies, more people will face extreme heat. Cities will seek passive cooling solutions. Clothing will need to return to natural, breathable, low-impact materials. Designers and researchers are beginning to look back toward desert dwellers, nomads, herders, and caravan guides for answers. They are studying the structure of robes, the flow of air between layers, the insulation without compression, the bioclimatic balance between sun protection and sweat evaporation. What they find isn't innovation, it's inheritance. The robe has already solved problems the modern world is only beginning to face. Scene to imagine, the robe at dusk. A man finishes his work in a dusty town on the edge of the desert. The sun is low. He removes his head wrap, shakes out the sand. His robe, now sweat-soaked, begins to cool as evening wind moves through the fabric. He walks home slowly, the hem of his robe trailing behind him, the folds catching light like sails in a sea of dust. Nothing dramatic happens, nothing heroic, but in his robe there is a quiet victory. The day didn't defeat him. The sun didn't burn him. The wind didn't break him, because he wore what history taught him to wear. Final reflection, the robe as wisdom. The desert robe is not just clothing, it is a library of survival. Worn knowledge, generational engineering, memory in motion. It doesn't just protect the skin. It teaches how to exist in a hostile world, not through domination, but through harmony. And in that way, the robe is not just a garment. It's a philosophy. To move lightly, to endure, to adapt, and to never underestimate the quiet strength of cloth. Story 7. The Salt Merchant's Silence, Whispered Journeys Through White Deserts. There are deserts so vast, so flat, so blinding that sound disappears. In northern Mali, in the heart of the Sahara, lies one such place, the Tanesrouft, the land of thirst. For centuries, caravans have crossed this arid expanse not in search of water but salt. Salt. Not gold, not spice, not oil. But that rough, white mineral we now shake casually onto our food. And yet, in the medieval Sahel, salt was so valuable, so essential, so heavy, that entire armies of camels moved it across the sands in quiet processions that stretched for miles. This story is not about great wars or kings. It is about the silent spine of West African commerce, the salt merchants who knew how to travel without maps, how to load beasts with rocks, and how to listen to the desert when no one else could. It is a story of survival in a place that offers nothing freely. The salt mines of Tayudeni. Our journey begins at Tayudeni, in what is now northern Mali. Today, it's a near-abandoned outpost, wind-scarred and sun-bleached. But in the medieval era, Tayudeni was one of the most important sources of salt slabs in all of West Africa. Miners, often enslaved or conscripted, dug shallow pits into the earth, some barely waist-deep, carving blocks of raw salt by hand. Each block, measured roughly 1 meter by 50 cm by 10 cm, weighed between 25 and 30 kilograms, was hoisted by hand, sometimes hundreds of times per day. They extracted the salt in silence, working under a sun so fierce that no birds flew and no shade existed. Tools were few, injuries common, deaths expected. Still they worked, because the salt had to move. The rise of the salt caravan. Once cut and stacked, the slabs waited. Then came the Azalai, the legendary camel caravans of the Sahara. Each Azalai, numbered hundreds, sometimes thousands of camels, was led by experienced Tuareg traders. Moved slowly, often at 2-3 km/h, across blistering flats. Carried 4 to 6 slabs per camel, often totaling over 100 kg. The journey from Taoudeni to Timbuktu, the primary market destination, covered over 500 miles, 800 km, much of it without water. The caravan took weeks, sometimes over a month, to complete a single round trip. Why do it? Because in the Sahel, salt was life. It preserved meat and fish. It replenished essential nutrients lost through sweat. It served as currency, sometimes more stable than gold. A single slab of salt in some periods could be traded for a live goat, a bolt of cloth, or even a person. The logic of silence. The salt merchants traveled mostly in silence. Why? Because sound carries strangely in the desert. It disorients. It draws attention. In open flats with little visual variation, noise could confuse camel lines, attract bandits, or mask the subtle cues of shifting sand. More importantly, silence allowed merchants to listen. To the wind, to the shifting rhythm of the caravan, to the breath of their camels, which often signaled illness or exhaustion before any visible sign. Even speech, when needed, was often minimal, short commands, gestured with fingers or eyes. The desert did not reward volume, it rewarded attention. Tools of the trade, simplicity refined. These were not high-tech operations, but the salt merchants had tools of remarkable simplicity and elegance. Wooden saddles, designed to balance the slabs evenly across the camel's spine. Leather pouches, sealed with fat to carry dates, couscous, and dried meat. Water skins, made from goat or camel stomachs, slung beneath the load for balance and shade. Compasses of stores, memorized by heart rather than drawn on maps. Each caravan also carried salt markers, left at intervals to guide return trips. Stakes or bones, used to mark wells or resting points. Burial cloths, because not every merchant made it home. There was no excess. Every item had a purpose. Every gesture had a meaning. Human cost, the hidden burden. Though often romanticized, these caravans were built on hardship and often on forced labor. Salt miners in Taoudeni frequently lived in open-pit camps, exposed to sun and sand, with bare rations, mostly millet and brackish water, under guard or obligation, working in debt or under coercion. Camel handlers, too, were often indentured or paid only after the caravan's return. If a merchant died or was robbed, they received nothing. And many died of dehydration, of salt poisoning, from excessive intake or wounds infected by salt dust, of snakebite, heatstroke, or abandonment. Their names are not recorded. Their graves, if marked, are buried beneath shifting dunes. Still, the system persisted, because the salt had to move, because across the Sahel people waited. Timbuktu, the white arrival. Imagine the moment. A caravan arrives at Timbuktu. Dust rises. The city is alive with expectation. Traders from across the Sahel, the Maghreb, and even Europe await. The salt is unloaded, block by block. Some is stored in warehouses near the Jingiriber Mosque. Some is traded immediately for gold, ivory, slaves, or textiles. Some is broken into smaller chunks, wrapped in cloth, and sold to villagers and nomads. In some years, thousands of slabs moved through Timbuktu. The trade fed the city's scholars, protected its independence, and funded its mosques. Salt funded books. Salt paid for brickwork. Salt paved the road for Islamic scholarship in West Africa. And yet, no one who bought it ever saw where it came from. The silence of the merchants followed the slabs all the way to the markets. Scene to imagine, night in the dunes. The caravan stops. A circle of camels rests, legs folded, sides steaming in the cool air. Men unpack small fires, boil tea, and unwrap salt-rubbed meat. No one speaks. One man lifts his eyes to the sky, tracking stars. Another adjusts a camel's load. The silence is not empty. It is alive with knowledge, the kind you cannot write down. Tomorrow they will walk again, and the desert, indifferent, will watch. But what happens when these ancient caravans stop walking? What happens when salt is carried by trucks, when markets change, when memory fades? Will the whisper of the salt merchants still echo in the dunes? The salt slabs still lie beneath the surface of Tayudeni, waiting in long, dry layers like buried treasure. But the world has changed. The caravans still come some years, but they are fewer now. The silence, once filled with the breath of hundreds of camels and the rhythm of quiet trade, has grown deeper. This section explores the slow decline of the salt trade, how it was shaped by roads, trucks, colonialism, changing diets, and forgotten memory. And yet it also reveals how, in fragments, the trade refused to die. Because salt is not just a commodity. It's a connector linking desert to river, tradition to survival, and past to present. The arrival of trucks. In the early 20th century, something new entered the desert: the motor vehicle. At first it seemed absurd. How could machines cross the featureless sand seas without roads, fuel, or water? Early expeditions broke down frequently. Tires melted, engines seized. Camels passed the wrecks like uninterested gods. But time and technology wore the desert down. By the 1950s and 1960s, colonial authorities and post-independence governments began to push for motorized salt transport. French and Malian officials built graded desert tracks. Burliot trucks built for Saharan terrain carried salt and troops. Mining operations in Tayudeni began to rely on diesel-powered machinery, not just picks and donkeys. A journey that once took weeks by caravan now took days by truck. It was efficient, profitable, clean. But something else was lost: the displacement of knowledge. The camel drivers knew the desert not by map, but by texture. The feel of sand under hoof. The shape of dunes after a windstorm. The changing stars overhead. Truck drivers, in contrast, followed GPS, radio calls, and compass bearings. Within one generation, young men no longer learned how to balance a salt slab. Routes once marked by ancient bones or cairns faded from memory. Desert survival skills, once passed from elder to apprentice, were no longer needed. Some of this was practical. Trucks needed less training. They moved more salt. But the shift also meant that centuries of embedded knowledge, unwritten, carried in gesture and silence, began to vanish. Colonial economics and the changing salt trade. European powers had little patience for slow caravans. To them, salt was a tax object, a weight to regulate, a means of controlling local economies. Under colonial rule, caravans were heavily taxed, inspected, often delayed for paperwork, compelled to register slabs, limiting movement. In some years, entire routes were shut down or rerouted to favor colonial administrative centers. What had once been a decentralized, semi-nomadic network of trade became a bureaucratic system governed by outsiders. Even after independence, many of these controls remained in place, replacing the freedom of the desert with permits, quotas, and regulation. The caravan, once a symbol of independence, became an inconvenience to modern governance. The decline of demand. Another change was quieter. People simply needed less salt. Why? Refrigeration became more common, reducing the need for salt as a preservative. Urban diets changed, relying on factory-processed food. Health campaigns warned against overconsumption of salt. In medieval times, salt was essential for preserving meat and fish, trade currencies, ceremonial uses. But in modern West Africa, imported table salt, iodized, packaged, and cheap, began to replace natural desert slabs. Markets shrank, slabs went unsold, caravans returned with fewer camels or not at all. In villages once fed by salt trade profits, youth turned to city jobs or migration. The echoes that remain. Still, the Azali did not vanish. Even into the 21st century, small caravans continue to make the journey from Taoudeni to Timbuktu. Nomads and semi-nomads still walk ancient tracks with their camels, bringing salt for festivals, religious events, or small-town markets. Some do it as pilgrimage to preserve tradition, to honor ancestors. Local communities in Mali and Niger have begun hosting cultural festivals, celebrating the legacy of the salt merchants. Old men still sit under trees, telling stories of sandstorms survived, camels that knew the way home, slabs that fetched gold once. Their tales are not entertainment, they are oral archives. Timbuktu, the market stalls shift. Timbuktu still receives salt, but the market looks different. Trucks now unload neatly stacked crates. Camels arrive occasionally, sometimes more for tourism than trade. Salt is sold in powdered packets, not carved slabs. Yet the old stalls remain. Wooden tables worn smooth by time. Hooks for hanging ropes and scales. Traders who still quote prices in camel loads, even when none are in sight. There's a strange kind of continuity in this mixture of old and new. It's not about purity, it's about persistence. The salt still comes, the sellers still haggle, the desert still waits. Scene to imagine, the last caravan of the season. Dust rises in the heat of mid-morning. A line of camels appears on the horizon, 10, maybe 12. The lead camel wears a faded leather bell. The driver walks beside it, robes flapping. They are not hurrying. The salt is stacked 4 slabs per beast wrapped in rough cloth. They pass a truck stalled in the sand, its tires sunk. The driver covered in grease waves. The camel train does not stop. It moves forward as it always has. The man does not speak. His eyes are on the sand ahead. He knows the road is changing, but for now it still belongs to those who remember it. Yet as memory fades and economies evolve, what is the future of these desert paths? Will the next generation ride camels or data cables? Can a tradition born in silence survive in a world of constant noise? The desert keeps its own time. It doesn't mourn what disappears. It doesn't record what it absorbs. Winds wipe away footprints. Dunes move slowly but persistently over ruins, wells, graves, and roads. And yet, even in this silence, some things endure not in form, but in function, in memory, in adaptation. The salt caravans may be fewer, their bells quieter, but their legacy walks alongside us in unexpected places, in trade, in resilience, in the quiet art of moving carefully through a dangerous world. As we close the story of the salt merchants, we're not witnessing an ending, we're observing a transformation. The merchants were never just traders of salt. They were custodians of movement, an idea that refuses to vanish, even when the road itself begins to fade. Knowledge transferred in movement. Ask any elderly Tuareg merchant and they will tell you, the true trade was not salt. Salt was heavy, salt paid for the journey, but the real product was knowledge. Caravans were moving schools. Young men learned how to orient by shadow. Children were taught the weight of a loaded camel by hand feel, not scales. Survival lore was passed down in halts and fireside murmurs, not in books. Even now, among nomadic families, directions are spoken in days, not kilometers. People still refer to ancient wells and shade trees, even if they are now gone. The phrase "we walked with the salt" is a shorthand for endurance, toughness, and wisdom. The caravan was an education system, and the road was a classroom that never stayed in one place. Salt routes as networks before maps. Centuries before modern borders, the salt merchants had built a kind of invisible empire. They connected the deep Sahara to the Niger River, desert oases to forest towns, Islamic scholarship in Timbuktu to markets in Gao and Khan. These weren't just trade routes, they were information highways. News moved with the caravans faster than letters. Political shifts, famines, and wars were whispered in salt camps, then passed on. Oral messages traveled with slabs. One merchant's journey was another's broadcast. Today, as satellite signals arc across the sky and fiber optics burrow beneath cities, it's easy to forget. There was once a network powered by silence, memory, and walking. The ghost markets, ruins of trade. All along the Sahel, one can find remnants of once thriving salt depots and caravanserais. Half-collapsed mud warehouses, once stacked to the ceiling with slabs. Stone enclosures where camels were hobbled. Burial markers for merchants who fell ill far from home. These ghost markets speak without sound. They tell of a time when trade moved at the pace of breath, when value was measured by how far you could carry something in the heat without it breaking or spoiling. A single slab, carried hundreds of kilometers, gained its worth through the journey itself. Today, logistics focuses on speed, but the salt merchants remind us, sometimes slowness was the point. The longer it took, the more the world changed around the journey. The more valuable the knowledge carried with the cargo became. Modern parallels, logistics in harsh environments. You might wonder what any of this has to do with today. In fact, salt caravans offer lessons still applied in humanitarian aid logistics in remote or conflict zones, nomadic healthcare delivery in areas without infrastructure, off-grid movement planning, where roads and fuel are unreliable. When aid workers today plan relief convoys across the Sahel, they consult not just maps, but local camel herders, salt route historians, old pathfinders, some of whom can recall wind patterns from decades ago. The road may now carry fuel instead of salt, but its wisdom still matters. Cultural legacy, the caravan in memory and art. In music, poetry, and oral history, the salt merchants are often evoked not for their wealth, but for their quiet heroism. Their virtues included discipline, rising before the sun, halting before heatstroke. Foresight, knowing how much water to carry, how to read the camel's knees. Patience, crossing vast distances without complaint. Solidarity, working in pairs, watching each other's loads, sharing food and fire. Even now, in Tuareg guitar music or Fulani stories, references to the white path, the salt wind, or the camel's silence are stand-ins for a way of being that has not vanished even if fewer remember the specifics. Scene to imagine, a child in Timbuktu. It is dusk. A child walks past the salt market in Timbuktu, holding a small bag of powdered salt. Her mother tells her stories of the old camel trains, of how her grandfather once led 30 camels from Taoudeni. The child asks why they don't come anymore. The mother shrugs. They do sometimes, but not like before. The child asks if she'll ever see one. Maybe, says the mother, if you're lucky, or if you learn the road. The child holds the salt a little tighter. Final reflection. When the sand forgets, the stories must not. The desert with time erases even the deepest paths. That's its nature. But the salt merchants never wrote in ink or stone. They wrote in the bend of a camel's neck, the feel of a rising wind, the silent agreement to move together toward a horizon that never ended. Their story is not just about salt. It is about how knowledge moves through difficult spaces, how memory survives without monuments. And perhaps that's the most important legacy of all. To walk carefully, to carry what matters, to speak only when the wind will not carry your voice away, and to leave behind no more than a footprint, but to leave it with purpose. Story 8. the cistern builders of the empty quarter. You are standing on the edge of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. It is not a place where you expect to find water. The desert stretches in all directions, blinding, blistering, and vast. Dunes rise like frozen waves, smooth and treacherous. No trees, no roads, no rivers, no cities. But deep beneath the sand, at the intersection of time, patience, and forgotten ingenuity, there are traces of the cistern builders, men and women who lived not by conquering the desert, but by listening to it. They did not carry water with them. They dug for it, stored it, harvested it, and saved it. Their tools were simple. Their math was imprecise, but they understood water better than most empires. This is the story of how people learned to survive in one of the driest places on Earth, not through conquest, but through quiet, methodical engineering. The Rub al-Khali, no place for the unprepared. Spanning 650,000 square kilometers, the Rub al-Khali covers much of Saudi Arabia, extending into Oman, Yemen, and the United Arab Emirates. Temperatures in the summer often exceed 50 degrees C, 122 degrees F. Rain falls rarely, often less than 30 millimeters, 1.2 inches per year. There are no permanent rivers, few natural springs, shifting dunes that can bury entire structures in a single storm. And yet, for thousands of years, nomadic peoples crossed it, camped in it, and built within it. They did not do this with faith alone. They did it with cisterns. What is a cistern? At its most basic, a cistern is a structure for collecting and storing water. But in the desert, a cistern is more than a reservoir. It is a survival mechanism, a marker of territory, a legacy passed through generations. Cisterns were dug by hand, some small enough for a single family, others large enough to sustain entire camel caravans for days. Some were lined with stone, others with burned lime plaster to reduce leakage. A few had intricate sluice channels carved from hardened mud to guide rainfall from miles away during the rare but violent desert rains. In a place where every drop mattered, the cistern builders became engineers of patience. Who were the cistern builders? The historical record is sparse. Few documents name names. Most of what we know comes from oral tradition, explorers' journals, archaeological digs in Najran, Al-Hassa, and Wadi al-Dawasir. The builders were often Bedouin tribes moving between seasonal pastures, date farmers who relied on minimal irrigation, pre-Islamic Arabian communities whose settlements left little trace above ground. These weren't empires. They were survivors quietly solving the greatest problem of desert life: where to find water tomorrow. How water was found. There were no modern drilling rigs, but there was knowledge. Animal tracks, especially gazelles and birds, were observed. These animals rarely stray far from hidden springs. Insect activity. Some ants build mounds near damp soil. Color changes in sand, a subtle difference in tone, could indicate moisture. Low-lying basins, where rain temporarily pooled. And above all, there was memory. Elders passed down stories. When your grandfather was young, he fell into a hole where the wind sings. Dig there. The water listens. Not scientific by modern terms, but often accurate enough to survive. The architecture of survival. Let's imagine a typical cistern from the 7th or 8th century. A pit roughly 3-5 meters deep, depending on the water table. Stone lining arranged in interlocking circles to prevent collapse. A sloped entrance, sometimes covered with woven matting or a rock slab. Near the mouth, earthenware jars or ropes and buckets, waiting for use. The cistern might be placed in a wadi, a dry riverbed that floods seasonally, where water runoff could be directed through stone channels. Some cisterns were shared, maintained by communities. Others were private, passed from father to son, hidden from outsiders for fear of theft. Dangers and maintenance. A cistern was valuable but also vulnerable. Dangers included sandstorms, which could bury the mouth and block access. Contamination from animals or decay. Theft, particularly in times of drought. To protect their cisterns, builders would camouflage entrances with stone and brush. Use inscribed stones with warnings or tribal markings. Assign rotating watchers during migration seasons. Maintaining a cistern meant clearing silt yearly, reinforcing walls with clay or lime, praying for rain and knowing how to catch it when it fell. Seen to imagine a rainfall in the Rub al Khali. It hasn't rained in 13 months. Then one afternoon the clouds gather, not many, just enough. The wind changes. The smell of wet air touches the ground before a single drop falls. The rain begins fast, hard, and gone in 20 minutes. But down a channel carved decades ago, the water races carried through bends in the sand, across rocks, into a mouth the width of a man's shoulders. Inside, the cistern fills, quietly, steadily. In the morning the men arrive. They say nothing. They lower a stone jar, haul it up, and taste, sweet enough. They nod. Another year has water now. Trade and the water map. Cisterns weren't only for drinking. They were part of trade routes. Merchants and camel caravans traveling from Oman to Mecca, Yemen to the Levant, Eastern Arabia to Persia, knew the locations of critical water stores. Some cisterns were charted in secret maps, not on parchment, but in poetry, mnemonic chants, and coded language. A single misplaced word could lead a caravan off course, ending in death. To know the cisterns was to have power: geographic, political, economic. But what happens when people leave the desert? When cities draw them away? When pumps replace buckets and trucks replace camels, do the cisterns remain? Or do they vanish, buried not by sand but by disuse? The sands of the empty quarter conceal many things: forgotten trails, buried ruins, and in some cases, entire systems of cisterns and rain channels, waiting patiently for a sky that might not open for years. But the builders of these structures weren't only concerned with the next rainfall. They were thinking ahead, sometimes decades ahead. In this section, we explore how the cistern systems evolved, how their knowledge spread across regions, and what happened to these desert engineers as nomadic life gave way to cities, fuel, and faucets. For centuries, the desert didn't change, but then the people did. The expansion of water engineering in Arabia. While the Rub al Khali was among the harshest places for cistern building, the techniques it required spread across the peninsula. In particular, the Hadramaut region of Yemen developed multi-stage cisterns, with upper catchments and overflow reservoirs to reduce flooding. Oman created the Falaj system, underground channels that linked mountain aquifers to distant farms. These often began with a hidden cistern. The Najd Plateau built large community cisterns near mosques and caravanserais, ensuring that both spiritual and bodily thirst could be satisfied. The design principles evolved, but the goals remained the same. Control the unpredictable, stretch the scarce, remember the path of water. The role of women in water stewardship. Although most visible desert engineering was performed by men, digging, lining, maintaining the custody of stored water often belonged to women. Women in nomadic and rural desert communities managed daily usage of household cisterns, controlled distribution during dry spells, taught children how to conserve, filter, and protect water. In some families, women carried the memory of which cisterns had failed in bad years, where secret family sources lay hidden. How to judge a cistern's remaining capacity by echo alone. Their role was less visible, but essential to long-term survival. Secrecy, ownership, and cistern theft. Water was life, but it was also power. This created tensions between tribes and clans. Stories passed down among Bedouins include cisterns poisoned with animal carcasses to deny rivals access, cistern entrances sealed or buried during migration to prevent theft, blood feuds that began over disputed water rights. Some cisterns were marked with tribal symbols, simple carvings, or stacked stones to signal ownership. Violating that signal could result in exile or death. And yet, in times of extreme drought, some clans opened their cisterns to neighbors. In these moments, hospitality overrode ownership, and survival depended on communal ethics stronger than law. When the ground ran dry, cisterns were never permanent solutions. In some years, the rains failed completely. Sandstorms choked entry points. Groundwater levels fell beyond reach. These empty years were marked by mass migration, temporary abandonment of homesteads, increasing conflict over dwindling sources. In the early 20th century, repeated droughts across Central Arabia triggered waves of movement from desert to town, from pastures to ports. Families who had used the same cisterns for generations left them behind, unsure if they'd ever return. The rise of diesel and the fall of memory. By the mid-20th century, change came fast. Diesel-powered pumps began replacing ropes and buckets. Tank trucks brought water to settlements that had never seen wells. Boreholes were drilled deep into fossil aquifers that had taken millennia to form. Suddenly, the old cisterns were irrelevant. Why wait for rain that might not come when you could? Pipe water from distant cities. Drill hundreds of meters below. Buy plastic containers instead of clay jars. The efficiency was unquestionable, but as water flowed from taps, the knowledge of the cistern faded first from practice, then from memory. Scene to imagine, a forgotten hollow. A traveler walks through a shallow wadi in the western Rub al-Khali. He stumbles on something strange, a depression lined with stone, half filled with sand. He crouches, brushes the sand away, finds the edge of a hand-shaped stone smoothed by time, once placed precisely to seal the water in. No one comes here anymore. The nearest village lies beyond 2 days' drive. And yet, when he shouts into the hollow, the echo returns, slowly telling him there's still space beneath, perhaps even a remnant of water. He drinks from his bottle, takes a picture, moves on. The cistern remains, waiting. The persistence of pattern, revival and research. In recent years, archaeologists and water conservation experts have returned to these ruins with fresh eyes. Why? Because climate change and urban sprawl have made traditional water systems newly relevant. Because cistern designs, refined over centuries, are now studied for low-energy water capture. Because rural areas still far from infrastructure need resilient, passive systems. Researchers have begun mapping ancient cisterns using satellite imagery, interviewing elders to recover forgotten techniques, reconstructing cisterns with modern linings for village use. And in some places, the practice has restarted not because it's quaint, but because it works. When the sky doesn't listen, cisterns were always conversations with the sky. They didn't demand, they prepared. In places like Wadi ad-Dawasir in eastern Oman, you can still hear phrases like, "The sky fills the deep when it is patient. What the cloud gives, the stone must remember. Only fools curse the sky without digging first." These aren't just poetic sayings, they're instructions. In a world of rising temperatures and falling water tables, the cistern builders may yet have something to teach us. But if these techniques are remembered only as ruins and not practices, will the future be able to learn from the past? Will the next drought revive these systems or bury them for good? The desert does not keep archives in books. It stores its history in the slow collapse of walls, the traces of hand-hewn stone beneath sand, and the subtle shifts in memory passed from voice to voice. The cistern builders may no longer draw water with ropes and clay pots, but the quiet legacy of their craft still holds meaning. In this final section, we explore the echoes of their knowledge, how ancient cisterns are being repurposed or rediscovered today, and how the balance between tradition and innovation may still hold answers for a water-stressed future. The desert has not forgotten. The question is, have we? Cisterns reborn, practical heritage. Across the Arabian Peninsula, where modern infrastructure meets ancient terrain, there is a resurgence of interest in traditional water harvesting methods. Examples include, in southern Oman, rural engineering projects are restoring old falaj systems, many of which begin with small, neglected cisterns. In Saudi Arabia's Najran region, preservation efforts are underway to catalog and clean out ancient community cisterns that had been unused since the 1950s. In parts of Yemen, despite ongoing conflict, locals have returned to maintaining seasonal cisterns in cliffside villages, partly out of necessity, partly out of tradition. These are not museum pieces. They are functional survival tools revived not to honor the past, but to endure the present. The irony of progress. As cities expanded across Arabia in the 20th and 21st centuries, governments spent vast sums building desalination plants, deep aquifer wells, water transport pipelines. These systems brought reliable access to millions, but at a cost. High energy consumption, vulnerability to disruptions, rapid depletion of ancient water tables. Meanwhile, some of the ancient cisterns, dug centuries ago by hand, still hold water after just one seasonal storm. Their efficiency lies in passive capture, minimal evaporation, community control. The irony is clear. In seeking technological mastery over water, we may have forgotten the value of waiting for it. Lessons in patience and limits. The cistern builders understood something modern planners often forget. Water cannot be rushed. They built their lives around intermittent abundance, chronic uncertainty, collective responsibility. They knew that water was never guaranteed, so they saved early, shared wisely, accepted limits. Their systems were scaled to scarcity, not abundance. In a time of climate volatility, these principles may offer more resilience than systems built on the assumption that shortage is temporary. Scene to imagine, a revival in the red sand. It's late afternoon in a village at the edge of the Rub al-Khali. A group of men and women, elders and youth, are gathered around a shallow depression in the earth. They're digging. Not for oil, not for artifacts, for water. An old cistern marked on no map has been remembered by someone's grandmother. They clear sand, reinforce the sides, repair a stone gutter that once caught runoff from the nearby rocks. The next rain may not come this year, but if it does, they will be ready. A child asks why they don't just order a tanker truck. An elder replies, "That water leaves when you sleep. This water waits where you leave it." Spiritual and cultural dimensions. Water in Islam and in many desert cultures carries not only practical value, but spiritual significance. Cisterns were cleaned before prayers, maintained as acts of worship, built near mosques and zawiyas to serve both body and soul. Hadiths emphasize the virtue of sharing water, the sin of hoarding it, the importance of preserving resources, even when they appear abundant. For the cistern builders, engineering was not separate from ethics. Their structures were acts of humility, shaped by the understanding that water belongs first to the earth, then to the community, and only last to the individual. Forgotten but not gone. Even where physical cisterns have collapsed, the language remains. The Arabic word sajil, to record, shares roots with the act of storing. Proverbs speak of hearts as vessels. What fills the heart, like water, should be drawn carefully. In poetry, lovers are compared to wells that do not dry, or cisterns in the storm. The cistern may be underground, unseen, but its idea lives in metaphor, in rhythm, in story. The desert teaches that what matters most is often hidden, and often quiet. Reflections for a dry future. Water scarcity is no longer limited to deserts. From California to Cape Town, from the Sahel to southern Spain, cities now face seasonal shortages, contaminated reserves, conflicts over groundwater rights. The answers are not always ancient, but the questions are familiar. How do we stretch a scarce resource? How do we build systems that survive failure? How do we store, not just consume? The cistern builders of the empty quarter did not solve these problems for all time, but they lived in the questions quietly, effectively, and together. Their story is not a model to copy, but a mindset to remember. Final scene, the cistern as monument. Somewhere, buried beneath shifting sand, lies a cistern that hasn't been opened in 100 years. No one remembers who dug it. The village it served is gone, the path to it erased. But inside, sealed by lime and time, there may still be water. Not much, just enough. Enough to show that someone once prepared, that someone once believed the sky would open again. That's what the cistern teaches us. Not certainty, but the courage to plan anyway.